Chapter 625. Blasts away in one punch. The battlefield had turned chaotic. Killings and flames of war could be seen everywhere. Yi Shiwen had initially taken full advantage of the critical situation of devils, and had killed their elite experts. He hadn't paid much attention to the situation of humans. He had heard more news after he had returned to the battlefield of humans and devil experts. Geniuses had risen to fame for a time, and had met their ends afterwards. They were like shooting stars. They had dazzled for a while, and then fallen down completely. Who is that man? Am I mistaken, or is he Yi Shiwen? Someone had recognized Yi Shiwen. The Xianyuan Palace Hall and the 10,000 Beasts Villa had condemned Yi Shiwen, and had distributed his pictures throughout the experts. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't come out no matter how much the Xianyuan Palace Hall and the 10,000 Beasts Villa had clamored in the last few months. Consequently, many people had declared him a coward who didn't dare to come out. However, they had now discovered that Yi Shiwen had arrived in the battlefield. This had instantly grabbed the attentions of countless top experts. It was impossible for them not to pay attention to him. After all, both Shoukuan and Li Yifeng had been stunning figures, and both of them had died at Yi Ziwen's hands. It was being said that he had used some secret technique for enhancing his power. However, it was still amazing enough. Nobody knew how many times this secret technique could be used. In short, he couldn't be underestimated. Many people didn't give value to Yi Ziwen's ranking. However, they also had no choice but to admit that he was very formidable. Yi Ziwen's rank at this time was entirely different from earlier when he had been an unknown player. His rank had improved at a very fast speed after he had fought for the last few months with all of his strength. He had already entered among the top 1,000 names. Apparently, he had just entered the strongest group. However, it was already a very fast progress for Yi Shiwen, who had fought his way to the top 1,000 experts from being among 10,000 names. His rank had fallen too much in the beginning. His ranking was still low because of falling behind in the beginning. However, he didn't have any regrets because he had obtained many things. He wasn't considered as a top-notch expert back then when he had just entered the devil world. In fact, he hadn't even entered the top group. However, he could now dare to say that he was one of the strongest individuals, and could even fight Shoukuan. His ranking and points were low compared to others. However, his trip to the devil world hadn't gone in vain. It's him. Yes, I can't be wrong. It's him, yes. I hadn't expected that he would appear himself today after nobody could find his whereabouts in the last few months. This opportunity has been bestowed upon us by the heavens. Reward of 500 million primary spirit dawn. A powerful expert said eagerly. He was obviously a senior expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. He had recently entered this realm. However, he was already regarded as one of the top-tier experts around here. The next step after having entered the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm was to make the breakthrough into the Great Sage realm. However, how could it be that easy to make the breakthrough into Great Sage realm? It needed very high talent, boundless opportunities, and huge amounts of resources. All these factors were indispensable. He could obtain huge volumes of resources after he had killed Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen was worth 500 million primary spirit dawn. This was an amount that could be used to summon the Star Colossus avatar just once. However, it was an astronomical wealth for the majority of people. It would also be regarded as a big income even by a great sage. It could even be considered as an instant success. Yeah, I don't believe that he's very powerful. He's merely an expert of the sage accomplished realm. He can't be compared with us even if he has some secret power, someone said loudly. Nobody could resist the temptation of 500 million primary spirit dawn. Several messages flew out in a short while. It was easier to obtain the reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn for transmitting information about Yi Shiwen, as compared to those 500 million primary spirit dawn. One could obtain 10 million primary spirit dawn as long as they transmitted information about him. Was there any reward easier to obtain than this? A black light suddenly appeared in the sky just when everyone was getting restless and thinking whether they should attack or not. Then, a huge claw swept down from the sky. Its speed was extremely fast. Many people didn't see it coming. It had already smashed down. Bang! Yi Shiwen suddenly trod away. His figure instantly moved away hundreds of feet and avoided the attack of that huge claw. An angry roar came from inside the clouds when the owner of the huge claw saw that Yi Shiwen had easily avoided its attack. It seemed as if a huge monster was roaring therein. Devil clouds surged about, and a huge head emerged out of them. It was approximately 4 or 5 meters in size. It had huge pairs of eyes like lanterns. Its entire body was pitch black and was covered in scales. It was extremely huge. It was dozens of meters tall. It was faintly visible inside the devil clouds. Its roar shook all directions. That is an ominous war dragon. Someone held their breath as they saw that huge head. How has this monster been attracted here? It is said that this ominous war dragon has been in the closed-door training for making the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. However, it was disturbed by someone, and it couldn't complete its breakthrough. It has now become mad, and is killing people everywhere. Nobody was left wherever it went. It couldn't make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. However, it already has its 1 foot in the Great Sage Realm. Nobody can match such strength. The top-tier disciples of our human race have also fought it. However, they couldn't deal with it. It's an exceptional ominous beast. I hadn't expected that it would be hidden here, and we won't be able to sense it. We might have been dead already if it were to be directed against us instead of Yi Shiwen. Someone said whilst being terrified. Yi Shiwen looked at it. It was a kind of subdragon. Dragons themselves were the strongest species in the entire world. It was said that they were the species that could challenge the gods. Therefore, it was very powerful even though it was just a subdragon. Moreover, its 1 foot was in the Great Sage Realm. So it was extremely difficult to deal with. That ominous dragon's huge pair of lantern-like eyes was fixed on Yi Shiwen. Its eyes were filled with greed. It could sense the vitality on Yi Shiwen's body, which was far more exuberant than that of an ordinary human. Its intuition told it that it could step across the threshold of the Great Sage Realm if it devoured Yi Shiwen. It had been frantically slaughtering people everywhere till now. However, it wasn't just because it had become mad in anger and had wanted to take revenge. It was also stealing blood essence from its prey since it could enter the Great Sage Realm only after having swallowed enough blood essence. It wasn't a real dragon. Therefore, it was impossible for it to be a great sage from its birth. Great Sage Realm was a huge threshold for it. It had been preparing for such a long time, but still couldn't make the breakthrough. This had made it insane, and it was looking for people to swallow everywhere. Its instincts told it that it could quickly enter the Great Sage Realm, as long as it swallowed this man. Bang! 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 Loud rumbling sounds came from the sky. That huge ominous dragon rushed over towards Yi Shiwen. The entire world swayed and lost its color under every step that it took in the sky. Its closed-door training was valuable. It hadn't made the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. However, it had managed to peep through the doorway of this realm. Therefore, it could use some methods that only a great sage could comprehend. That's why it was so rampant. Yi Shiwen sneered. Such great sage level means were incomparably deadly for an ordinary expert of the late stage of half-step great sage realm. However, it wasn't enough for Yi Shiwen. He had fought many great sages, and had even slaughtered great sages. So these means were far from enough to faze him. The huge ominous beast rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It opened its mouth wide like a sacrificial bowl, and spouted mouthful of huge devil light. The light swept across the sky just like a laser cannon, and broke the void. It opened a huge crack in the space as it went straight towards Yi Shiwen. It was extremely dreadful. This was the killing move of this ominous beast. Many people were overwhelmed with shock as they saw this scene. They thought in their mind, how would we have responded if we had been in his place? They realized that they could only escape. In fact, many people realized that they couldn't even escape, and would be vaporized by this devil beam. Humph! Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. He clenched his fist and shot a punch. It set off golden waves, and they swept up in an instant. Bang! Yi bang! Yi Shiwen blasted the incoming devil beam. This was beyond everyone's expectations. Yi Shiwen's golden fist had smashed the devil beam into pieces in the sky. Everyone was stunned to see this scene before their eyes. They felt terrified as they looked at Yi Shiwen. He was just too powerful. They weren't surprised by the fact that he had survived under such a fatal blow. After all, many people among them could do this. However, effortlessly exploding the devil beam in one casual fist like he had done was far beyond their imagination. It was impossible for their bodies to withstand such an attack. Their bodies had already become perfect after having made the breakthrough into the sage-accomplished realm. However, perfect didn't mean powerful. So, it was impossible for them to contend against these ominous beasts depending upon their bodies. In fact, they considered fighting using brute physical strength disgraceful. They used to say that it was uncivilized. However, Yishuan had done it. And he had done it without fooling around. The people who had been getting restless and had wanted to grab Yishuan earlier in order to obtain the reward were now feeling a chill running down their spine. Forget about other things. Just the dreadful strength revealed by Yi Zaiwen's fist just now was far from what they could handle. Yishuan didn't stop even a bit after he had defeated the devil beam. He trod forward and transformed into a streamer of light. Then his body rushed towards that ominous beast. He stretched out both of his hands and forged ahead to fight hand-to-hand with that ominous beast. Yishuan clenched his fist, and it emitted golden rays of light. And there occurred a massive explosion at this crucial moment when that ominous beast was about to dash away. Bang! A huge rumbling sound was heard. Yi Zaiwen's fist penetrated the layers of space and struck the huge head of that ominous dragon. That ominous dragon screamed, and its body went out flying just like a stringless kite. It smashed through several mountain peaks, and then finally came to a halt. Everyone was left dumbstruck. Is he even human? Can someone blow away a subdragon with bare hands? Yi Zaiwen's cyan clothes fluttered in the cold wind and issued a fluttering sound. He looked like a god of war. Chapter 626. Yi Zaiwen's strength had thoroughly stunned the people in the surroundings. It wasn't that they had never seen an incomparably tough body. However, they had truly never seen a body that was so powerful that it could blow away a subdragon in one punch. One fist had blown away a subdragon. Such fighting prowess had made everyone tremble with fear. That ominous war dragon roared. It faced upwards and roared loudly. It had never suffered such a defeat. It had been blown away by someone in just one punch. This was a matter of extraordinary shame and humiliation for it. Moreover, this human in front of it wasn't a great sage. He wasn't even an expert of the late stage of half-step great sage realm. However, he still possessed such an incredible body. However, this incident hadn't dispelled its desire. In fact, it was coveting Yishuan even more now. He has such a powerful body. So his vitality must also be exuberant to an incredible extent. Great Sage Realm won't be far away once I've swallowed him. No wonder it had had such an intuition. A strange expression appeared on its huge face as it thought of this. It didn't retreat. Instead, it once again rushed towards Yishuan. However, it didn't attack Yishuan directly since it knew how formidable Yi Zaiwen's body was. Instead, it spouted a devil beam as it approached him at a flying speed. Yishuan sneered. This beast is acting recklessly. It is daring to launch an attack on me even now. Yishuan moved. He stepped forward, and the entire sky swayed. The scene looked even more dreadful than that of the recent attack of that ominous dragon. It seemed from afar as if a humanoid ominous beast had attacked. The entire world had lost its color. The complexions of all the experts who were witnessing this scene from afar changed without any exception. Many people had been planning to plot against Yishuan. But they gave up that idea as they saw this. Won't we be courting death if we attack this humanoid monster? Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist once again struck that ominous dragon's head. And its huge body went out flying upside down. It had again gone out flying just like a stringless kite. It was an extremely frightening scene. Yi Zaiwen's fist had made that ominous dragon dizzy. But its mind was still working. However, Yishuan had already set out at this time. A fist once again smashed down. Bang! 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 The heavy shaking sounds reverberated tremendously. This incomparably powerful ominous dragon got crushed to death by Yishuan. It soon lost its entire vitality. Then Yishuan collected its corpse. After that, its corpse was transformed into energy by the heavenly source mirror and poured into Yi Zaiwen's body. Yi Shiwen felt that his entire martial power had advanced considerably. One must know that his martial power hadn't promoted for a very long time after he had reached the pinnacle of the Sage Realm. However, it had now made a big progress once again. This was very rare. Everyone was left dumbstruck. They were blankly staring at this scene before their eyes. That incomparably frightening ominous dragon had been killed. This was way too terrifying. It had been punched to death. This result was even more terrifying than a direct defeat. This was absolute crushing power. Yi Shiwen hadn't given it any room to fight back. This was like crushing a red fruit. Yi Ziwen's gaze was ice cold. He swept his vision across everyone. Then he thought, this kind of slaughtering must have deterred everyone. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of these people. However, there's a saying many ants together can kill an elephant. Moreover, these people weren't ants, and their number was huge. So it would be troublesome for Yi Shiwen to kill all of them. Therefore, it would be better to deter them and make them not dare to attack. Yi Shiwen was waiting quietly and didn't take any step. Why hasn't Yi Shiwen left this place yet? Is he waiting for someone? Someone abruptly arrived to this conclusion and turned pale with fright as a result. Does he know that we've sent information about his whereabouts? Is he waiting for those people who possess evil intentions for him? Someone guessed, and the surrounding lost its color all of a sudden. It'll be too terrible if it's so. Where is Yi Shiwen? Suddenly, a loud shout came from afar. It swept across whilst rolling through the clouds. A dozen people arrived along with this loud shout. All of them were terrifying experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. They were dressed up in shaggy fur clothes from head to foot. It seemed from their clothing that they had arrived from an extremely cold place. They turned out to be the experts of the northern barbarians. One would find the southern barbarians if they continued to go south beyond the four sides of the central plains. And they would find the so-called northern barbarians if they went all the way towards the north. Northern barbarians had always been one of the big threats for the allied forces of the central plains. They were very powerful. Countless armored horsemen would come south all year around from their extremely cold place. The living environment of the northern barbarians was the nastiest among the four barbarian races. Therefore, they were the strongest and the most aggressive ones among them. It needs to be mentioned that they hated the people of the Central Plains the most. Even a high-level force like the true Martial University didn't hold a good opinion regarding the northern barbarians. Those four barbarian races had been its main opponents even back then when it had been ruling the entire true martial world. They had arrived for Yi Shiwen at this time. So, Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. Killing intention was surging in them. Yi Ziwen's vision penetrated the layers of void. He then saw that a youth who was dressed in the attire of the northern barbarians was leading the group. This youth had the vigor of a dragon and the ferocity of a tiger. He had rough facial features and a tall stature. He had mounted a precious black piebald horse. That horse also had an outstanding appearance. It was a demon beast of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. The young experts of the northern barbarians behind him had also mounted horses. And all of them were precious horses of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. All of them possessed the bloodline of the demon beasts. It seemed that they could evolve and become dreadful demon beasts at any time. Everyone had a bad look in their eyes as they saw these people. Northern barbarians deserved to be called as a nation of horsemen. After all, not everyone had such financial power. These precious horses couldn't be bought. They were priceless. After all, these horses had cultivated to the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. This proved that these precious horses weren't ordinary. You're Yi Shiwen? These experts of the northern barbarians had ridden for 1,000 miles on their horses, and had arrived here before Yi Shiwen in an instant. That young leader of the northern barbarians coldly looked at Yi Shiwen, and said in ice-cold tone, "Isn't this man the 13th prince of the northern barbarians a Gouda?" Many people clearly recognized the origins of this young group of northern barbarians as they arrived. That young leader was indeed the 13th prince. He was the strongest disciple among the experts of the northern barbarians who had arrived in this Devil World competition. The difference between the northern barbarians and the experts of the other areas was that the northern barbarians' imperial clan itself was the most tyrannical force of the northern barbarians. It wasn't clear since how many years they had been ruling the northern barbarians. Nobody knew how profound the background and strength of the northern barbarians' imperial clan was. They only knew from the records mentioned in the history books that the northern barbarians' imperial clan had been contending against the true martial university since the time they had been ruling the northern barbarians. The northern barbarians were different from the southern barbarians who had split up into countless forces. The northern barbarians only had two big forces at present. One was the northern barbarians' imperial clan, while the other was the northern barbarians' shaman school. At least half of the experts of the northern barbarians belonged to the northern barbarians' shaman school. Several outstanding heroes were also linked with the northern barbarians' shaman school. Therefore, the northern barbarians had turned out to be a very powerful group in every previous Devil World competition. In fact, their leaders had never fallen down from the top 20 positions on the merit list. Moreover, they were ranked in the top 10 most of the times. The northern barbarians' 13th Prince Aguda was the most tyrannical among all the experts who had arrived from the northern barbarians this time. He was known as a young barbarian king. He was born late in comparison to some other senior experts. However, he possessed extremely tyrannical strength. He was also a powerful contender for the position of the northern barbarians' emperor. Aguda was ranked 11th on the merit list. He hadn't entered the top 10 ranking. However, he was just one step away from it. It needs to be mentioned that the merit list just used to record the number of devil experts one had killed, and the points they had obtained for that. So his strength wasn't necessarily weaker than that of those who were in the top 10 positions. Aguda didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to reply, and spoke up himself. Ha ha ha. Finally, I Aguda have gotten lucky. I'll get 500 primary spirit dawn after I kill this ant of sage accomplished realm. I'll go for closed-door training after returning. Great Sage Realm isn't far away. Yes. Emperor's throne am coming. Aguda seemed to be somewhat crazy. However, his tone was extremely cold. He was treating Yi Shiwen like an ant that would certainly die. Yi Shiwen was nothing in his opinion. What is urgently needed will cost a lot of effort. However, it'll be achieved inadvertently. The throne is mine from today onwards. Aguda looked at Yi Shiwen in a manner that made it seem as if he was looking at a treasure. 500 million primary spirit dawn was an astronomical figure even for Yi Shiwen, let alone for them. The 10,000 Beasts Villa and the Xianyuan Palace Hall had collaborated to put forward such an astonishing reward. These two forces also had the approval of the ancestors of both forces. Otherwise, it was simply impossible for them to gather such a big reward. Yi Shiwen, you're no match for me. Quickly surrender, and you may avoid physical pain. Yi Shiwen, kill yourself. Well, leave your corpse intact. The young experts of the northern barbarians behind Aguda began to clamor one after another. An ordinary person would have already been scared to death while facing so many young barbarian experts. However, Yi Shiwen was unfazed by them. He just coldly looked at Aguda and replied, "It's not easy to cultivate up to your current level, let alone bringing about your own destruction." This sentence sent everyone in uproar. They hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would make such a bold statement. After all, everyone believed that Aguda had a clear upper hand at this time. They wouldn't have been surprised if Yi Shiwen had spoken up strong words at this moment. He was Yi Shiwen after all. However, they hadn't thought that he would say this. What is going on? Is everyone here mistaken? Could it be that Aguda doesn't have the upper hand right now? It seems that you're very reckless. But don't think that you've done something extraordinary by killing Shokuin. Apparently, you've gotten carried away because of having temporary luck. So I'll wake you up to reality. Aguda finally moved at this time. The horse on which he was sitting looked up and neighed. However, it wasn't the sound of a horse's neigh. It was a demon beast's roar. This horse appeared just like an exceptional ominous beast. It trod on its 4 hoofs which broke the void. It was extremely terrifying. Chapter 627. Aguda was sitting on that outstanding horse. He finally moved at this time. and a spear suddenly appeared in his hand. It pierced the void, and suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. Everything happened only in that split second. It was an extremely terrifying sight. Aguda didn't let down his top-notch 11th rank on the merit list. His strength wasn't a bit inferior to that of Shokuin. Shokun's strongest aspect lied in his foundation. However, things like foundation weren't always beneficial. It wasn't an easy thing to transform one's foundation into fighting prowess. Shokun's background might have transformed into his tyrannical strength after he had made the breakthrough into Great Sage Realm. However, his foundation had made him only slightly stronger than his peers when he hadn't made the breakthrough, and was in the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. It hadn't created a conclusive impact. Shokuin had been popular as a veteran. After all, he had had 1,000 years of experience. There hadn't been any expert as experienced as him among those who had participated in the Devil World competition. However, he was still ranked 6th on the merit list. There were some people who were more tyrannical than him. Aguda was ranked 11th. However, he wouldn't have lost if he had fought Shokuin. Therefore, he didn't give importance to Shokuin. This was his confidence. It was something that other people seemed to be lacking. However, how could Yi Shiwen be an affable person? He wasn't a pushover either. So he eventually moved while facing Aguda's sudden attack. He suddenly trod forward, and covered dozens of feet instantly. He arrived in front of Aguda, and shot a fist. The surrounding environment suddenly transformed into a starry universe, and Yi Shiwen became the only god in that universe in that instant. Then his fist transformed into a big star, and suddenly smashed down. He was well aware of the fact that he must first take down the ringleader. This Aguda is clearly the leader of these people. So I must annihilate him first. Afterwards, it'll be easy to deal with those other northern barbarian experts. These northern barbarian experts had an army background. So, they used to think like soldiers. They had spread out in a battle formation. So they were very difficult to deal with. Suddenly, Yi Zaiwen's golden vitality infected the entire universe, and illuminated the entire sky. This is bad. Aguda's complexion changed violently. He finally reacted at this time. Yi Shiwen had revealed far more powerful strength than that of an ordinary expert of the sage accomplished realm. In fact, even an ordinary expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm wouldn't be even 1/10 as ferocious as Yi Shiwen. Aguda had finally understood how ridiculous the rumors were. The rumor that Yi Zaiwen's strength had promoted because of using some special secret technique seemed meaningless now. It wasn't like that. Aguda himself had seen now that Yi Zaiwen's strength was so incredible that it had overshadowed his own. This realization was naturally unpleasant for him. He used to think that it was impossible for others to surpass him. He had been confident that he was the strongest person under the Great Sage Realm. He had believed that nobody could be compared with him. However, he was now apprehensive to face Yi Shiwen. Suddenly, the spear in his hand blossomed endless white mists. They froze the space, and obstructed the path of Yi Zaiwen's fist, which was coming from the front. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's speed was incredibly quick. He effortlessly exploded the layer of white ice that had condensed from those endless mists. It couldn't even reduce the momentum of Yi Zaiwen's fist. Ding! Yi Zaiwen's fist smashed on top of Aguda's sage-level spear. Aguda's spear began to shake violently even though it was a sage tool. The dreadful power reached to his hand after passing through the spear. Aguda had always been known for his body. However, the web between his thumb and forefinger ruptured in an instant. His palm got badly mutilated, and he almost dropped his spear. So strong! Only this thought was left in his mind. The contempt and disdain that he had had earlier looked very ridiculous now. All his contempt and disdain had now caused a humiliation for himself. Aguda became insane with anger as he realized this. After all, when had he been humiliated like this by someone? Yi Zaiwen's strength is tyrannical. But he shouldn't have dared to humiliate me. Then, the ruptured web between his thumb and forefinger was frozen by the ice almost in an instant. After that, his wounds restored at a rapid speed under the layer of ice. However, the movement of his hand didn't slow down. The spear suddenly swept out like a dragon. It transformed into a small white dragon. and rushed straight towards Yi Shiwen whilst passing through the horizon. Yi Shiwen was very close to him at this moment. So, it was a heaven-sent golden opportunity for him. Therefore, he had used the most tyrannical skill of his life. This spear surmounted the space. It even surmounted time. This spear was the strongest among the spears that he had used in his entire life. It instantly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. It had transformed into a small white dragon. And this small dragon had opened its mouth wide. It seemed as if it would definitely swallow Yi Shiwen whole. This small white dragon's body possessed endless ice energy. It looked substantial. It was sparkling and lustrous. It seemed as if 10,000 beasts would submit before it, and the entire heaven would be suppressed by it as it suddenly flew out. This spear was the strongest strike that a Buddha could launch. He now knew about Yi Zaiwen's strength. He also knew that this man wasn't inferior to those top 20 dreadful people on the merit list. Therefore, he had forgotten about the humiliation that he had suffered a moment ago, and had attacked with his entire strength. He hadn't held back since he wanted to kill Yi Shiwen in an instant. However, how could Yi Shiwen surrender? He suddenly moved. Then he clenched his fist, and shot a fist upward. However, it was just a casual punch. It wasn't something wonderful. It just blasted out golden waves. He hadn't used any flashy martial technique. It doesn't matter what kind of tricks you have. My fist will break 10,000 laws. The golden waves condensed into a small golden god, and welcomed that approaching white dragon. This was his dragon slayer technique for slaying dragons. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist and that small white dragon collided with each other. Yi Shiwen felt that that small white dragon's ice energy had frozen his arm, and then his entire body. This ice energy could even freeze a 10,000 years old volcano. It was extremely exceptional. Aguda's home, the dwelling place of the northern barbarians, was one of the coldest places in the entire world. So, Aguda, who had grown up in such a place, was best in using ice-type power techniques. His one attack could freeze the entire sky. However, his ice energy got thoroughly annihilated in a split second by Yi Zaiwen's golden light. Consequently, the ice couldn't spread any further. That little white dragon also broke down inch by inch under Yi Zaiwen's stunning divinity waves. It couldn't maintain its form, and got extinguished. The momentum of Yi Zaiwen's fist didn't stop. It finally smashed down on that spear with an irresistible force. Ding! The entire spear once again began to tremble after bearing Yi Zaiwen's powerful attack. The tremendous power penetrated the spear, and slammed into Aguda's body. Crack! Aguda's inner defense armor got smashed into pieces. A divine tool was simply nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's absolute tyrannical strength. Aguda's internal organs had sustained injuries. He had cultivated his body to an extremely perfect condition, and his internal organs had strengthened because of that. Otherwise, his internal organs might have gotten ruptured by that tremendous power. His offensive was simply nothing in front of the momentum of Yi Zaiwen's fist. Aguda's complexion turned deathly pale. He repeatedly retreated several hundred feet, in order to avoid Yi Zaiwen's fist attack. He was panting unceasingly. There was a look of extreme bewilderment in his eyes. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen was so terrifying. Aguda was ranked among the top 20 experts on the merit list. But it was quite difficult for him to receive even one of Yi Zaiwen's blows. The disparity in their strength wasn't a qualitative one like the disparity between Sage and Great Sage realm. However, there was an enormous quantitative disparity. Aguda knew that human experts had enormous energy limitations in the devil world. However, he didn't know that the situation for Yi Shiwen was completely different. This place was like Yi Zaiwen's home ground. He could directly use the devil energy of the devil world. The devil energy couldn't cause any effect on him. In fact, he could directly use it as energy source. Therefore, he wasn't afraid of anyone in this devil world. You have a death wish. Aguda became angry as he saw the slightly careless expression on Yi Zaiwen's face. Horseman draft west. Aguda had finally used the unique skill of the northern barbarians' imperial clan horseman draft west. This was a complete set of battle formation techniques. A spear swept out, and it seemed as if the sound of war cries had begun to reverberate in the entire world in a split second. The horsemen were charging everywhere violently. The entire world had transformed into an Azura battlefield. Everyone had surrendered in front of this mighty force. This was the power that ruled the entire world. This was the representation of the artistic conception of his spear technique. It was extremely dreadful. Yi Shiwen clenched his fist, and a punch smashed down. It landed into that Azura battlefield. It seemed as if it would destroy the world. The arrogant and despotic Azura cavalrymen who had been slaughtering everywhere a moment ago screamed one after another and vaporized. His tyrannical spear technique was simply nothing in Yi Ziwen's eyes. He could destroy any artistic concepts. This was the most direct method of destroying artistic concepts. And only Yi Shiwen could do this. Bang! Aguda finally couldn't block the dreadful strength of Yi Ziwen's fist. The horse on which he was sitting was suppressed by the power. Its legs got crushed, and it crouched down in midair. It was screaming and yelling desperately. Aguda also couldn't withstand it. His majestic body went out flying just like a stringless kite. Your Majesty! Those northern barbarian experts finally reacted at this time. They shouted one after another. They were very anxious. It wasn't that they had reacted slowly, or were sitting and watching this entire time. The fact was that the speed of both individuals was extremely fast. They didn't get enough time to react. Aguda wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen. However, he was still incredibly tyrannical in comparison to other people. Therefore, these people had been willingly following him. However, their powerlessness had become the deadliest factor now. They couldn't catch up with Yi Ziwen's and Aguda's speed. They could only watch helplessly as Aguda got blown away. They couldn't do anything. However, Yi Shiwen didn't stop. Instead, he rushed in Aguda's direction. Chapter 628. Yi Shiwen took one step forward. He had arrived in front of Aguda in an instant. It seemed as if he had cast a magical power that had shrunk the large distance in between them to an inch. The entire world shook. It seemed as if a huge thing had smashed down all of a sudden. Aguda's followers roared when Yi Shiwen caught up with him. Their eyes had turned bloodshot. However, it seemed as if they weren't afraid. They desperately wanted to obstruct Yi Shiwen in order to borrow some time for Aguda to recover. These people were Aguda's followers. They had thought that Aguda would ascend to the throne. Therefore, their entire alliance would collapse if he died now. A northern barbarian youth rushed with an extremely fast speed. It was clear that the speed of the horse that he was riding was faster than that of other people's horses. His horse was inferior to Aguda's horse. However, this disparity was small. Yi Shiwen didn't show any mercy. He stamped his foot and kicked the horse on which that northern barbarian youth was sitting. He had resorted to extreme methods. The northern barbarian youth was also a top-tier expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. He differed by just one step from the Heaven's Pride experts. He was certainly an important member in Aguda's party. In fact, he was his most important confidant besides those great sages who backed Aguda. He was strong enough to run amok among his peers. However, he wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen. Bang! The neck of that ominous beast-like horse broke under Yi Ziwen's kick, and it was sent flying. Ha! The northern barbarian youth roared in grief and indignation. This horse had accompanied him in all his expeditions till now. However, it had now been killed by Yi Shiwen in just one kick. Yi Ziwen's terrifying power awed the several experts who were watching this fight. He was way too frightening. Flap! 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 Yi Ziwen's speed was incomparably fast. The golden wings unfolded behind him, and his speed immediately promoted to a dreadful extent. Bang! He clenched his fist and punched that northern barbarian youth on his chest. Bang! That dreadful expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm seemed just like a child in front of Yi Shiwen. He didn't have the power to fight back. He got exploded in just one punch. He just wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen. The northern barbarian people who had reacted and arrived had finally understood that Yi Shiwen wasn't a source of easy profit. He wasn't a weakling as mentioned in the rumors. The rumor that he had killed Shokuin by depending upon some secret technique appeared very ridiculous now. Would such a powerful person need some secret technique to kill Shokuin? They didn't know how terrifying Shokuin was. However, he couldn't be more terrifying than this slim man who was present before their eyes. Yi Shiwen had killed a top northern barbarian expert in just one punch. However, he didn't stop. He attacked once again. Those northern barbarian youths had gathered around Yi Shiwen by this time. Their response had been extremely slow. However, their speed was very fast. They had surrounded him in a split second. Moreover, it was impossible for them to retreat at this time since they were Aguda's followers. They must buy some time for him to recover. But how could Yi Shiwen not know what they were thinking? However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about it. Aguda was indeed powerful. But Yi Zaiwen's strength had increased even further after he had absorbed that ominous dragon a moment ago. So it was impossible for Aguda to rival him. Yi Shiwen pounced over like a ferocious tiger. He burst into those northern barbarian experts as if a tiger had forced into a flock of sheep. These people could be rated as elites in front of others. However, they were nothing more than lambs in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. Yi Zaiwen's attack immediately caused a bloodbath. They couldn't withstand even one of his moves. They couldn't stop his footsteps. Yi Shiwen kept moving in Aguda's direction whilst killing all the way. His speed was extremely quick. Everyone tried to slow him down with all of their strength. However, he rushed into the troop of the northern barbarian experts like an arrow. No, Aguda had recovered a bit. However, his eyes became wide opened as he saw his loyal and devoted followers getting slaughtered like chickens by Yi Shiwen. Tears of blood had started to flow out from Aguda's eyes in desperation. He had recruited these followers by himself. He had thought back then that he would help them in obtaining a lot of benefits by taking advantage of this Devil World competition. Thereafter, they would be a huge assistance for him in conquering the Emperor's throne. But who would have imagined that they would be crazily slaughtered by Yi Shiwen? Countless experts became terrified as they saw this scene. The northern barbarian experts, who had always been known as fierce and strong people, had lost gradually at Yi Zaiwen's hands. It's extremely terrifying. Yi Shiwen is so strong. He looks even more formidable as compared to earlier when he had killed that ominous dragon. He has easily resisted the joint attacks of those northern barbarian experts. Such strength can be said to be unrivaled in the entire world. He has become even more powerful. How can it be possible? The speed of Yi Zaiwen's attacks became even faster. Nobody could withstand the power of his blows. Bang, bang, bang. These young northern barbarians were being annihilated and transformed into masses of blood fog one after another by Yi Shiwen. They couldn't pose any threat to him. Meanwhile, the tyrannical experts of various forces had gathered in an ethereal microcosm, situated in the mists in the true martial world. Even the weakest among them were the tyrannical experts of the Great Sage Realm. There was no shortage of frightening experts like Huang Wuji and Mu Xingjie among them. Moreover, a group of supreme leaders were seated on a tall platform, which was hidden in the depths of this place. They wouldn't pay attention to common people. They seemed just like the legendary gods from the fables. Each one of them was a supreme lord of a force of the true martial world, and the top-tier experts of every force operated under them. All of them could run amok in Great Sage Realm without any scruples. However, they were now left in shock as they saw the names and points of all of the young experts of the northern barbarians getting erased one after another from the merit list. The merit list had constantly changed along with the participation of several youths of the Devil World. Many experts had been killed, but it wasn't strange. However, all of the northern barbarian experts were being killed one by one now. They all disappeared from the merit list. One by one. The current emperor of the northern barbarians suddenly stood up from his spot. His eyes were filled with shock. He couldn't believe that all the experts of the northern barbarians had been annihilated one after another. 6 or 7 individuals had disappeared from the merit list within the blink of an eye. They hadn't been even 10% of the total number of the northern barbarian experts. However, they had been true elites. In fact, they had belonged to the most elite bunch. Loss of even one of them was enough to make him feel bad. Let alone such a crazy loss. It was the loss of one individual with each snap of the finger. What is happening? How can it be like this? The eyes of the emperor of the northern barbarians remained wide opened. He shouted loudly in frustration. The sound spread out, and it seemed as if the entire space would collapse. This was the current emperor of the northern barbarians. He was a terrifying expert of beyond great sage realm. This emperor had gone and insincerely consoled the villa lord of the 10,000 beasts villa, when the villa lord had obtained the news of Shokun's death. This emperor had been feeling very happy inwardly. A person like Shokun had been merely in the half-step great sage realm. However, everyone had known that it was just a matter of time for him to make a breakthrough into the great sage realm. He hadn't been an extremely formidable expert like Huang Wuji. However, he had been far above from being compared to ordinary geniuses. Such an expert was enough to grab every lord's attention. There was nothing to fear for them. However, these ambitious and powerful lords believed that it was better if all the powerful experts of other forces died at once instead of dying one by one. After all of these lords wanted to rule the entire world. That's why this emperor had gone to insincerely console the villa lord along with other lords. Even he himself couldn't help but laugh on his own falsehood. However, the wheel of fortune had reversed now. He had been insincerely consoling other people back then. But he himself had suffered disastrous losses now. These experts of the northern barbarians had been Aguda's followers. However, Aguda was one of his sons, and he was an ambitious lord. So he would consider every son's force as his own force. Therefore, the death of each of these experts was a loss for his force. These followers might not be capable of reaching to the great sage realm. However, even just the possibility of it was enough to make him depressed and mad. What had made him even more mad was that these experts had been Aguda's followers. They had always accompanied him. And they had been killed one by one now. Was it Aguda's turn now? Aguda was just one of his many sons. However, he had always been partial towards him as compared to his other sons. In fact, he wanted Aguda to grow to such an extent in the future that he could contend against his elder brothers. Therefore, an accident now could make him mad. Aguda's name was also flickering on the merit list now. This meant that he had already sustained serious injuries. Those so-called ordinary experts were nothing in his opinion. He wouldn't regret too much no matter how many of them died like ants. However, Aguda was his favorite son. The emperor of the northern barbarians was depressed now. However, the villa lord of the 10,000 beasts villa was happy. The emperor of the northern barbarians was dressed in an azure dragon attire, and was exuding the aura of an emperor from his body. On the other hand, the villa lord of the 10,000 beasts villa was fond of the leather fur clothes, which was the attire of the people of the southern barbarians. It looked ordinary. However, nobody knew that it had been made from the fur that had been peeled off from the body of a powerful ominous beast. It would make people tremble with fear even if they shot a glance at it. It seemed as if an ominous beast had reincarnated. The 10,000 Beasts Hall itself had earlier been an organization comprised of those southern barbarian experts who had willingly submitted to the true martial university. They had the ability of controlling beasts. Therefore, the true martial university had specially set up a hall. This hall had established outstanding martial arts accomplishments during the true martial university's golden days. However, they had chosen to betray the true martial universities after its decline. The villa lord had earlier noticed the fake expression on the face of the emperor of the northern barbarians. It had been an exceptionally hateful thing. However, he hadn't been able to do anything. But it was his time to take the pleasure of revenge now. Suddenly, a talisman carrying a message broke through the barrier of space and reached all the lords. It contained the details of all the experts of the northern barbarians who had been killed. What? It's him. How can it be possible? Chapter 629. What? It's him. How is it possible? The news that all the lords had received in their hands had been transmitted from the devil world, and had carried information on the people of every force. However, all of them were left in shock this time. That's because the news that they had obtained stated that several experts of the northern barbarians had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. These lords had been a bit unfamiliar with this name earlier. However, they didn't find it unfamiliar now. The first time that Yi Zaiwen's name had entered their minds was when he had won the martial arts championship. All the lords had come to know at that time that there was such a person. Yi Shiwen might be nothing at this time. However, he might shine in the future after 100 or 1,000 years. These lords would still be strong and vigorous at that time. They might have retired from their current positions. However, they would still be supreme elders. Therefore, it was impossible for them to ignore Yi Shiwen. Those lords were left in shock as soon as they saw the record that Yi Shiwen had killed Shoukuan. Shoukuan had a tyrannical impression in their minds. They had believed that he might become the backbone of the 10,000 Beasts Villa in the future. However, this person about whom these lords had been well aware had now died at Yi Ziwen's hands. This had to make them surprised. However, they were only surprised and nothing more. After all, it was like a competition between two ants in their eyes. The weaker ant had somehow won. But it wasn't enough to leave them in shock. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had disappeared for a few months after that. So, many of these lords had already forgotten about it in a flash. However, they had once again heard this name now after Yi Shiwen had killed many youths of the northern barbarians. Aguda was the most outstanding expert among the youths of the northern barbarians. But even he was about to die at Yi Ziwen's hands. The lords had obtained the ins and outs of this matter. Aguda had been chased by Yi Shiwen, and Aguda's followers had unceasingly tried to obstruct Yi Shiwen in order to save Aguda. Consequently, all of those followers had died at Yi Ziwen's hands. The attack had been so fierce and decisive that it had made everyone a bit surprised. Yi Shiwen had once again appeared after being missing for the last few months. Some smart lords guessed that it was most likely that Yi Shiwen already had absolute certainty of his win. Otherwise, nobody would be so foolish as to appear out in the open. Yi Shiwen had earlier managed to kill Shoukuan depending upon some secret technique. However, things like secret techniques, if used continuously for making up for a deficiency, could certainly have big side effects and so on. It was obvious that Yi Shiwen hadn't paid a small price in order to skip levels to kill Shoukuan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have remained hidden for a few months. So he had to have absolute assurance now when he had appeared again. They could also see from the records that Yi Shiwen hadn't been a match for an expert of the late stage of the half-step Great Sage realm in the beginning. However, the experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm seemed just like a flock of sheep in front of him now. They didn't have the power to fight back. Even the potential future lord of the northern barbarians' imperial clan Aguda was chased down by him. Therefore, these lords could clearly see that Yi Ziwen's strength had advanced by leaps and bounds in the last few months. Aguda was in imminent danger now. How dare he? The northern barbarians' emperor opened his eyes wide to glare. He then coldly looked at the true Martial University's Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord's expression was calm and composed. He didn't care about the threat of the northern barbarians' emperor. After all, it was impossible for them to interfere in this matter since all the forces of the true martial world had together drawn up this rule. Even the people that occupied the position of lords didn't dare to interfere since all the other forces would rise up against them in that case. No force had the courage to bear such a consequence. Moreover, which force hadn't faced such a loss? The true Martial University had also come across such a situation when its experienced and high-handed top experts of the younger generation had gotten wiped out in a battle. He's gone. Aguda's name has been erased. An expert suddenly shouted, and everyone's vision went there. Aguda's name had occupied the 11th position on the merit list. But it had been erased now, and his position had been taken by the person who had been ranked 12th on the list. Everyone knew the meaning of being erased from the merit list. What did it mean? It meant that that person had been killed, that he had died in the devil world. A person's name would be erased from the merit list only after their death. The complexion of the northern barbarians' emperor changed abruptly. An incomprehensible expression was flickering in his eyes. It wasn't clear what he was thinking. A look of hatred flashed in his eyes, and then his expression once again became calm and composed. It seemed as if the whole world couldn't affect him. Everyone knew that he was brimming with murderous intent. He was an emperor. He was the emperor of the northern barbarians. Moreover, he was an ambitious man. So, it was impossible for him to tolerate the matters that had gone beyond the scope of his expectations. And this matter was an example of that. The Devil World competition wouldn't continue forever. It would certainly end one day. And his anger would perhaps burst at that time. Many people knew what Aguda's position in the emperor's heart was. So, they were afraid for Yi Shiwen. The Supreme Lord shot a glance at the Northern Barbarian's emperor. But he didn't say anything. He quite clearly knew his intentions. So he just let out a contemptuous snort as a reply. This Yi Shiwen is too ruthless. He attacks without any hesitation. He is another unscrupulous man. First Shokuin who was as outstanding as Huang Wuji and Mu Xingjia. And now a Gouda. He has already offended 2 big forces to death. The Northern Barbarians' imperial clan has an abundance of experts. However, an expert like a Gouda is unlikely to be born often even in their clan. Such an expert has died at Yi Zaiwen's hands now. So, it would be a wonder if the Northern Barbarians' emperor left this matter as it is. A great war would be unavoidable when the time comes. Many people were whispering. This matter might spark a conflict between the Northern Barbarians and the true martial university. In fact, it might push these 2 old enemies to war. However, the true martial university was indifferent about it. After all, one would stop worrying when they're up to their ears in debt. The true martial university had many enemies. They had so many enemies that one more wouldn't cause any difference. In fact, they would have many enemies even if a few of them reduced. Meanwhile, in the devil world. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's punch blasted a Gouda. A Gouda didn't have the power to fight back under his continuous pursuit. They hadn't even fought 10 rounds, and a Gouda had been exploded by his fist. Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold vision penetrated the layers of void. The smell of blood rose in the blowing devil wind to an incredible extent. Corpses were lying everywhere on the ground. These incomparably ferocious barbarians had thought of making easy profits in this matter. They had thought that they could obtain 500 million primary spirit dawn if they found Yi Shiwen first. However, they had now become a pile of corpses that were littered on the ground. This scene was extremely shocking. Yi Shiwen stood quietly, but his voice spread over thousands of miles. Who else is coveting those 500 million primary spirit dawn? Come together. I'll be sitting alone on the Devil Mountain Range for the next 3 days. I'll be waiting for the heroes of the world. This statement left the entire world in shock as soon as it came out. How many heroes were there in this world? Isn't this statement of Yi Shiwen against heaven's will? He has openly challenged all the heroes of the world. Many people thought that Yi Shiwen had gone crazy. He had undoubtedly killed Shokuin and a Gouda. However, what did that have to do with this proclamation? After all, those were only 2 heroes among all the heroes of the world. There were experts in the world that were even more tyrannical than them. There wouldn't have been any problem if it were to be one-on-one battle. However, his statement was equivalent to attracting the entire world's experts. What kind of aspiration was this? It didn't matter whether he was arrogant or he considered himself superior to others. His words had shaken the entire world. Is a war going to take place between all the experts of the world in 3 days? Perhaps the title of the strongest person under the great sage realm will be his if he is truly going to sit there and wait. Then, Yi Zaiwen's next statement shook the entire world once again. The heroes of the devil race are also welcome to join, without any exception. Everyone will be entertained. Yi Zaiwen's action of challenging so many human experts at once had left everyone in shock. But his invitation to the many young experts of the devil race had made them feel that he had truly gone insane. After all, the devil world was the home of the devil race. Human experts often couldn't display their entire fighting prowess in the devil world. Therefore, they would always be in a disadvantageous position while competing with the devils. A human expert with strength on par with their devil counterpart would often suffer a defeat because of this reason. Yi Shiwen was extremely powerful. So one-on-one was already an easy thing for him. However, it would be one-on-many now since he had challenged several experts at once. Ling Fei was looking at Yi Shiwen with her big eyes whilst blinking. Yi Zaiwen's strength might not be worthy of mentioning in her opinion. And this journey had always been a fun game for her. However, her heart surged a bit at this moment since nobody had ever made her feel like this. Also, nobody had ever aroused such peculiar fluctuations in her mood. These 2 statements in the cold wind had uplifted Yi Zaiwen's slim cyan figure in her galaxy-like glittering eyes. Who was the most outstanding genius of the generation? This was the most outstanding genius of the generation. This feeling had made her heart palpitate madly. It was somewhat unbelievable for her. However, it wasn't a bad kind of feeling. Yi Zaiwen's statements had shaken the entire world. It's hard to fathom a person's mind. However, it wasn't difficult for him to guess what these people were thinking. They just think that I'm insane. An ordinary person would indeed think that I'm insane since I've challenged the heroes of the world and made the entire world my enemy. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't a fool. He obviously wouldn't act unreasonably. The Wheel of Fight was of little significance for Yi Shiwen, since he could directly transform the devil energy and possess the Phoenix regeneration technique. He wouldn't be defeated because of the Wheel of Fight, as he could restore to his most peak state in a matter of moments. However, this didn't mean that he was careless. After all, he knew that any one of those heroes could pose a threat to him. On top of that, there were so many of them. Yi Shiwen couldn't stop them from coming at him at once. So a fierce and bloody battle would certainly take place in that case. Yi Shiwen had issued the challenge even after being fully aware of this. This was because he wanted to use this battle for tempering his cultivation realm. He needed to stabilize his current realm within a short period of time, and the only shortcut for that was battle. He wanted to use the battles to perfect his realm, so that he could become an overlord under the Great Sage realm. In addition, he was also tempering his mind. After all, a real match is a combination of strong physique and powerful mind. Chapter 630. Yi Shiwen was sure that he was powerful when it came to strong physique and mind. His incomparable confidence had originated from his strength itself. However, the aspects that he mostly lacked were innate talent, foundation, and so on. He had always been quite powerful. However, he had never had much confidence in himself. Therefore, he was different from the stereotypical image of geniuses that people had in their mind. Yi Shiwen had never felt like a Heaven's Pride expert, even though he had been branded as one by the people. After all, his accomplishments were because of the mysterious space to great extent. He had progressed so quickly because of that mysterious space. He was now planning to use the countless talents whom he would defeat to obtain the strongest physique and mind, and thereby identify his own martial road. He had already reached close to the Great Sage realm in the blink of an eye. Most of the martial experts used to be similar in the beginning. Their cultivation, martial arts accomplishments, foundation, and even wisdom were copied from various senior experts. However, they would gradually begin to move towards their own path as their cultivation grew more and more profound. And Great Sage Realm was the most important step of this process. This was because a martial cultivator would begin to lay their own road from the Great Sage Realm. There were innumerable famous powerhouses in the entire world. However, none of them completely resembled someone else. Every powerful person was stubborn. Being stubborn made them believe in themselves. It would make them believe that their path was right. People who don't turn around even after they've knocked against a wall are often stronger and more stubborn. Therefore, the road that one chooses in the beginning is very important. One would continue to walk on the wrong path forever if they had chosen the wrong path in the beginning. So how would they have big achievements in that case? Yi Shiwen wanted to utilize this opportunity to sharpen his own road and gradually clarify on which road he wanted to walk. However, this was a very long process, and it was just the beginning now. This was also what Emo had taught him. Any powerful person of a generation is like this in the beginning. Even the Devil King, the leader of the Devil world, was like this in the beginning. Yi Zaiwen's words had spread widely. They had spread to the ears of all ambitious people. They had shaken everyone, as if a pot had exploded. His words had received everything: respect, contempt, and even curses. However, Yi Zaiwen's reputation had undoubtedly risen because of this matter. Countless top-tier experts had come to know about the man named Yi Shiwen. Many people believed that Yi Shiwen would certainly become a dreadful Super Heaven's Pride expert in the future, if he survived for long. A person who has the courage to challenge the entire world can't be a lunatic. He would become peerless. The devil wind whistled, the devil clouds surged on, and a figure arrived from the distant place. He was dressed up like a barbarian. He was a disciple of the southern barbarians' 100 Barbarians Cave. Someone recognized him as soon as he appeared. He was the chief disciple among the 100 Barbarians Cave's core disciples. He was known as the Young Barbarian King. People used to call him by this name. However, he possessed extremely tyrannical strength. People had forgotten what his real name was over the years. His ranking on the merit list was better than that of a Buddha. He was ranked 10th. He had easily broken into the top 10 ranking after Yi Shiwen had killed Shokuan. However, nobody dared to deny that he possessed powerful strength. A group of disciples of the 100 Barbarians Cave followed him from behind. Big brother, we must kill Yi Shiwen as soon as possible. We've investigated and found that he had killed our disciples when he had been in the southern wilderness. We haven't celebrated even a single day since then. He has become very arrogant now. So the prestige of our 100 Barbarians Cave will definitely strengthen enormously after we've killed him. An expert of the 100 Barbarians Cave spoke up in a low and muffled voice. Many barbarians were simple-minded. However, who would remain simple after having cultivated to this extent? This chief disciple also knew that Yi Zaiwen's reputation had risen enormously at present. So their reputation would also rise enormously if they killed him. They would definitely receive special training from the 100 Barbarians Cave in the future, if they could rise above the most outstanding disciples of the entire true martial world. Making a breakthrough into the Great Sage realm would be just a matter of time at that time. Kill him. The young barbarian king shook his head. His expression had turned somewhat dignified. He has effortlessly killed a Buddha. In fact, he has wiped out the northern barbarians' entire team. Even I wouldn't have assurance whilst dealing with such a person. Do you think that he has challenged the people of the entire world without any assurance? It should be mentioned that Yi Zaiwen's reputation had risen just a bit after he had killed Shokuan. However, his reputation had caught up with that of the top players after he had killed a Buddha in front of everyone. The young barbarian king would have certainly launched an attack on Yi Shiwen without any hesitation before Yi Shiwen had killed a Buddha. However, the young barbarian king had become much more cautious after he had heard about a Buddha's crushing defeat. He was still confident that nobody could defeat him. However, he was also cautious and timid. Wouldn't 500 million primary spirit dawn slip away from our hands if we didn't kill him? That expert of the 100 Barbarians Cave said rather unwillingly. We'll definitely obtain those 500 million primary spirit dawn. But not like this. The young barbarian king replied in his ice-cold voice. He looked vicious and rough from the outside, and didn't seem to be a cunning person. However, he was an extremely sharp person in reality. He knew that many people must have this thought. However, he didn't want to go there and stand out among others because standing out among others would often cost a person their life. And Yi Shiwen was like this only. Whoever took the initiative against him would bring about their own destruction. Yi Shiwen had already sensed that the young barbarian king was more tyrannical than a Buddha, as soon as young barbarian king and other people had arrived. However, he didn't pay attention to him. After all, he had effortlessly killed a Buddha. Therefore, he didn't pay attention to the young barbarian king, even if he was more powerful than a Buddha. He was still waiting with his eyes closed. He was waiting for enough formidable people to arrive, so that he could create his road to invincibility. More and more experts had arrived. Yi Shiwen just felt a powerful tyrannical aura of the young barbarian king. The energies of all the experts who had arrived in the surroundings had locked onto Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if the entire energies present in his surroundings were congealed, and not a bit of it could be absorbed. However, Yi Shiwen didn't mind and continued to absorb and breathe the energies. Those tyrannical auras couldn't stop him from cultivating. Good Yi Shiwen, you have some skill. However, today is the day of your death. Several experts had already surrounded Yi Shiwen out of nowhere. Each one of them was an expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. Experts with strength lower than this realm didn't even dare to arrive because there were too many experts present at this place. So many experts had never gathered together in a Devil World competition. All the top-tier experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm of the true martial world had arrived. They looked somewhat excited. They had a bit of assurance that they would certainly kill Yi Shiwen. So they were planning to take advantage of this critical situation. The voice had barely faded away when a tyrannical devil energy arrived after passing through the entire world. Then, a tyrannical devil expert arrived in front of everyone whilst laughing frantically. He was a great devil. He was dressed up in plain and simple clothes. However, there was a sinister expression spread across his entire face which was covered with scales. He wasn't dressed up in magnificent clothes. However, they were sparkling just like stars. He was a devil expert. However, the experts present on the spot recognized him as a great devil. However, they didn't need to say anything as Yi Shiwen had already recognized this great devil at a glance. He had faced all kinds of devils in the last few months. So, how could he not have recognized that he was one of the strongest devil experts under the great sage realm? Buluo. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. Finally, someone had arrived who made him excited. He hadn't heard Buluo's name just a few times in his expedition of the last few months in the devil world. Buluo was a prominent figure among the devil experts. There was a big difference between the devil race and the humans. It was that the devils were very careful about the bloodline that they had inherited. Some were born in the sage realm or the legendary realm, while others were born merely in the weak Hotian and Xiantian realms. The different bloodline would almost decide the achievements of their entire life. Buluo was born in the Great Devil clan. It was one of the 8 noble clans of the devil race. The Great Devil clan was commonly considered as a bunch of cannon fodder. However, it also had noble and ordinary people in the clan. The disparity between the noble and the ordinary people of the Great Devil clan was as big as the difference between heaven and earth. 99% of the top-tier experts of the Great Devil clan had originated from the noble bloodline. So it was simply a myth that the ordinary great devils could stand out. However, Buluo was a great devil expert of the ordinary bloodline. It would generally be impossible for a devil expert like him to stand out among others. He could only be used as a cannon fodder and sent to the battlefields of the devil world expeditions. Buluo wasn't a nobleman. However, he had emerged out among several geniuses depending solely upon his astonishing willpower and outstanding talent. Therefore, he was extremely famous among the devil experts under the Great Sage realm. I've heard that Buluo had offended a great sage, and had gotten chased for thousands of miles as a result when he had been in the sage realm. However, he had still managed to escape. Consequently, he had benefited from misfortune, and had entered the half-step Great Sage realm. He is incredible. I hadn't expected that he would be the first one to come. He is a bloody devil expert. His method is extremely fierce. So, I don't know whether Yi Shiwen will be able to stop him or not. Yi Shiwen is extremely arrogant. So I don't find him pleasant to the eye. However, I don't want him to lose to a devil expert. Everyone suddenly began to talk because of Buluo's arrival. Yi Shiwen had become famous in the entire world after he had killed a Gouda. However, Buluo had already become famous long ago. Even the humans who were his archenemies clearly knew about his past achievements. You humans are a bunch of spineless cowards. Buluo's ice-cold devil eyes swept across everyone, and he said disdainfully. He looked down on these human experts. Everyone was against Yi Shiwen at present. However, nobody would care if he killed this devil expert. After all, there was a big enmity between the humans and the devils. This was the general idea. Those devil experts present at the distant place had initially planned to arrive here. However, they could only watch from afar once several human experts had arrived here. After all, just one mistake could cost them their lives if they got surrounded by human experts. Their bodies would then disappear without a trace. However, Buluo had dared to appear here alone. This was beyond everyone's expectations. Chapter 631. Neither those experts nor Yi Shiwen had anticipated that Buluo, a devil expert, would dare to appear when several human experts were present here. Yi Shiwen had obviously found that devil expert's faintly discernible figure behind all those experts. He had challenged the outstanding heroes of the entire world, and this included the devil experts. However, he had believed that the devil experts would wait until a bitter fight would break out between him and all the human experts, and they would arrive to receive an easy advantage afterwards. However, this Buluo was audacious. He was quite intriguing. Yi Shiwen raised the corner of his mouth and let out a smile. You humans are a bunch of spineless cowards. Buluo's words suddenly made all the human experts boil. Many experts were embarrassed endlessly on being insulted by a devil expert. However, they didn't have anything to say. Several people had surrounded Yi Shiwen. Yet nobody was willing to step forward. They didn't want to stand out among others. After all, anyone who would act like a mantis would be eaten by the Orioles. A devil expert had taken the initiative now. This was a matter of extraordinary shame and humiliation for them. So many ill-tempered experts wanted to go out and kill Buluo first. However, Buluo didn't provoke the human experts any further after he had spoken this sentence. He instead turned towards Yi Shiwen and said, "I've heard your name. However, it was unfortunate that I hadn't gotten an opportunity to fight you. I've heard that you've challenged the outstanding heroes of the entire world. Therefore, I've arrived. You must be courageous since you've dared to do so. But it would be better for you to die at my hands instead of dying at the hands of these wretched humans." Extremely arrogant. These words emerged out in everyone's mind at this time. He's very cocky. What is Yi Shiwen in comparison to Buluo? He's merely a tiny troublemaker. Yi Shiwen had challenged the outstanding heroes of the entire world. However, he still viewed them as outstanding heroes. However, Buluo simply didn't pay attention to them. He had scorned them as a bunch of spineless and wretched cowards. These experts were elites among elites in the human race. They were geniuses among geniuses. So how could they accept this humiliating evaluation? Many of them couldn't take it anymore. They were just about to rush out to kill this mad devil. Bang! Buluo didn't wait for Yi Zaiwen's reply. His imposing aura suddenly swept out. The devil energy on his body rose, formed a tornado around his entire body, and soared straight into the sky. The complexions of several experts who had wanted to kill Buluo initially changed as soon as they saw this scene. Such strength could intimidate a person even if they had seen it from afar. Yi Shiwen was in front of him. He appeared like a small boat that could collapse at any time in the face of the gigantic waves of Buluo's imposing aura. Bang! Buluo attacked. A fist suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. Buluo's hands were emitting a black jade luster. This was the result of cultivating the fist technique to the peak. The martial technique that he had cultivated wasn't an ordinary one. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen opened his eyes. There was a surprised expression in his eyes. Buluo indeed has enough tyrannical strength. He has a great agility skill as well. So even the combined attack of all the human experts might not be able to stop him if he uses his entire strength in order to escape. Buluo had planned to attack relying upon his incredible agility. This was why he was so domineering. However, he had overestimated himself. Moreover, he had underestimated Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen moved. His vitality suddenly rose. It then condensed into a scarlet column of energy and soared to the sky. He was standing far away opposite to Buluo. His complexion didn't change as he faced the approaching tornado which had been formed from Buluo's fist. Suddenly, Yi Zaiwen's golden divinities crawled over his entire body, and the golden rays of light emitting from his body illuminated half of the horizon. He looked like a god from afar. A god who had arrived on an expedition in the devil world, and had shaken the entire world. His imposing aura transformed violently. He had transformed into a whale from a small boat. That whale then cleft through the waves. Even the shower of tornado couldn't sway this powerful sea monster. Good. Buluo wasn't shocked as he saw Yi Zaiwen's aura bursting out violently. In fact, he was pleasantly surprised. This was rather excellent. He was a mad fighting devil. So killing more tyrannical experts would bring more pleasure to him. In fact, he was obsessed with this. He had unceasingly challenged more and more powerful experts, and had killed them. His cultivation had suppressed several formidable experts of the Great Devil Clan, and he had become one of the strongest experts of the Great Devil Clan under the Great Sage Realm. He was a mad fighting devil. Yi Zaiwen's face was expressionless. A fist swept out. It was just a mediocre fist, but it had transformed into a big star as soon as it had swept out. Then that star's flames grew more and more as it rose. The storm set off by Buluo's fist momentum was nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's Big Bang Stardust fist. It got destroyed in a snap of the fingers. Bang! The two fists collided in the sky, and incredible rays of light were emitted. Loud sound reverberated, and dreadful shock waves swept out. The space of the devil world was instantaneously destroyed wherever these shock waves went. Several weak experts moved away one after another in order to save themselves from getting swept away by this dreadful tornado. Crack! An ear-piercing sound of fracture was mixed in with that dreadful sound of explosion. It sounded particularly ear-piercing. Then a figure went out flying from inside that tornado. He had held his one arm with the other, and there was an expression of disbelief on his face. It was Buluo. Buluo looked at Yi Shiwen incredulously. His eyes were filled with horror. His arm had been ruined in one fist blow. In just one fist blow. He had never thought that this would be the outcome. Yi Shiwen was formidable in his opinion. However, it should have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to match him. After all, he had never lost while competing with his peers. Even he himself didn't know when arrogance had gradually emerged in his mind. He had casually arrived here looking for Yi Shiwen, and he believed that he could effortlessly kill Yi Shiwen in front of everyone. So he had been treating Yi Shiwen like an ordinary expert of the late stage of half-step great sage realm. The two sides had begun fighting only a few moments ago, and his entire arm had already been destroyed, and that too in just one fist. Cold sweat was dripping from his dark face, which was filled with scales. The severe pain had spread throughout his body, which made him almost unconscious on the spot. This pain would have surely made him unconscious if he hadn't experienced countless life and death battles, and hadn't been accustomed to injuries. What had truly made him surprised was Yi Zaiwen's body. Buluo was dependent mainly upon the cultivation of his fist technique, so body was obviously his biggest advantage. He was confident that he wouldn't fall into a disadvantageous position, even if he came across those well-known legendary physiques of the devil race. Therefore, he was very confident that he would kill Yi Shiwen in one fist. However, who could have imagined that Yi Shiwen would teach him a big lesson in just one attack? Buluo's body could be considered as strong. However, Yi Zaiwen's body was even stronger than his. Yi Shiwen had created the tyrant body technique in the beginning with the intention of dominating and contending against the devils and gods of the entire world, even if there were several hundreds of them. Yi Shiwen was much more tyrannical than Buluo. This fight had immediately revealed the winner and loser. Yi Shiwen sneered. His key strength was his invincible body, and his weakness was his lower realm. So Buluo would have come across as somewhat ferocious if he had tried to suppress Yi Shiwen with his stunning magical power. Yi Shiwen wouldn't have been able to injure him so easily in that case. However, competing with Yi Shiwen depending upon the body was a hopeless venture. Yi Shiwen pursued Buluo. He was feeling some pity in his heart since he knew that Buluo had reached to this extent depending upon his ordinary great devil body. However, Buluo's unrestrained killing intention a moment ago had thoroughly enraged Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's speed was already too fast. But his speed had reached to an all-new level after he had unfolded the devil wings. His figure immediately arrived in front of Buluo just like an afterimage. Bang! Yi Shiwen shot a simple punch. Anyway, how would Buluo not have known his own situation at this time? The excited look of meeting an opponent that had been present on his face a moment ago had already disappeared. And an unprecedented thought had emerged in his mind at this time. It was to turn around and escape. He had never escaped from a battle whenever he had fought with his peers. But such a thought had suddenly aroused in his mind now. However, this thought had merely passed his mind when Yi Zaiwen's fist smashed down. Yi Zaiwen's fist pressure broke the space and shook the entire world. A boundless aura swept across the enormous starry sky. Buluo only got the time to raise his hand to resist. Ding! A metal clanging sound was heard. Yi Zaiwen's fist smashed down on his other arm, and the crack sound was heard once again. Yi Shiwen had destroyed his other hand as well. Buluo's forehead was densely covered with sweat because of the severe pain. It wasn't clear how many fights he had experienced. He looked at pain as if it was nothing. However, this time he had almost fallen unconscious because of this terrible pain. The unbearable pain had seeped into his soul. It had already broken away from his body. Ah! Buluo screamed. This devil screech was world-shaking. His loud scream had scattered the devil clouds in the sky. However, it couldn't reduce his pain even a bit. Buluo might have been hesitating to escape earlier. But he didn't have any hesitation now. He had to escape right now. Otherwise, he wouldn't get the chance later. Buluo turned around, transformed into a magic light, and was about to escape. He had seemed overbearing when he had arrived a while ago. However, he was running away like a dog under Yi Zaiwen's chase now. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they saw this scene before their eyes. They had thought a moment ago that Buluo was extremely ferocious and arrogant. However, he had been rendered a stray dog within no time. No, Buluo isn't too weak. Instead, Yi Shiwen is just too strong. Some people reached to this conclusion. They didn't believe that Buluo was too weak. Buluo wanted to escape. However, how could Yi Shiwen let his enemy escape? He stepped forward and arrived on Buluo's side. Then a fist suddenly struck Buluo's body. Bang! Buluo's incomparably strong body went out flying under Yi Zaiwen's fist. It disintegrated in the air, and his soul was extinguished. Then the whole scene turned quiet. Everyone just heard a shocking sentence. You want a one-on-one battle? Or will you come at once? Chapter 632. Miscalculation. You will fight together or one-on-one battle? Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold voice seemed to have come out of hell. He forged ahead and suppressed the surrounding space as if it were made of cotton. Then he suddenly stamped his foot and shattered the entire space. Everyone couldn't help but hold their breath as they saw this scene. They hadn't expected that this could be the situation. Buluo wasn't weak. In fact, he was very powerful. However, he looked as weak as a lamb in front of Yi Shiwen. Some people had finally started to understand why Yi Shiwen had dared to challenge all the outstanding heroes of the world. He was undoubtedly very arrogant. However, he also had the qualifications to back up his audacity. Anyone else present on the scene wouldn't have had such assurance if they had been in his place. He had defeated Buluo very easily. So it was no wonder that he had dared to openly challenge all the heroes. A person would have such confidence if they had strength. On the other hand, a person who didn't have strength would naturally be cocky as well as ignorant. This was the kind of world where the strong were revered. Yi Zaiwen's strength had left everyone in shock. However, all of these experts suddenly became angry when they heard Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold words, will you fight together, or do you prefer a one-on-one battle? They admitted that Yi Shiwen was ferocious. However, they were also top-tier experts who could deter a region. So they absolutely couldn't let him insult them in this way. Yi Shiwen, your arrogance will destroy you today. You've dared to provoke us outstanding heroes. Therefore, you're destined to die. A figure came out from the sky soon after Yi Shiwen had finished saying. He looked at Yi Shiwen from afar with an ice-cold expression on his face. It seemed as if he was looking at a dead person. Yi Shiwen raised his eyes and shot a glance. This man was Feng Lung. He was another extremely formidable expert of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. Just like Li Yifeng, Feng Lung had the top-notch strength among all the core disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. In fact, he was even more powerful than Li Yifeng, whom Yi Shiwen had killed. Li Yifeng had died. So, Feng Lung now held the supremacy among all the core disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. You have only this much courage? Yi Shiwen let out a contemptuous smile. He looked away from Feng Lung and didn't pay attention to him. He had already noticed these people. He had waited for a very long time, but Feng Lung hadn't dared to come up. Feng Lung seemed to have been hesitating. These people possessed tyrannical strength. However, they had also lived for hundreds of years. In fact, some of them had already surpassed 1,000 years. Therefore, everyone among them was a cunning fox. Nobody wanted to take the lead. All of them wanted other people to attack first. They had been playing this good tactic. Buluo had taken the initiative, and that had been just as they had wished. However, Buluo had been annihilated by Yi Shiwen at a lightning speed. He hadn't been able to pose any threat to Yi Shiwen. Yes, Yi Shiwen, today is the day you die. Nobody can save you today. You're indeed outstanding. You've also made a supreme contribution to our true martial world in this Devil World competition. However, you've provoked us outstanding heroes now. And this means that you've chosen to die. Several experts spoke up one by one after Fanglong. All these people had evil intentions for Yi Shiwen. They wanted to kill him and obtain those 500 million primary spirit dawn. All of them were top experts in the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. And the aim of their lives was to enter the Great Sage realm. However, it wouldn't be possible if they had shortage of wealth. 500 million primary spirit dawn could help them in progressing to the Great Sage realm. So this was the best opportunity for them. They couldn't let this opportunity slip by their hands. Some even craftier people had thought of stealing Yi Ziwen's treasures as well. Yi Shiwen was very powerful, so he had to have some extraordinary treasures. Almost every one of them was thinking this. All of them wanted to rob him. You people clearly don't have the courage to fight one-on-one. So come all at once. Yi Shiwen laughed recklessly. He looked somewhat disappointed. However, he was also a bit excited. These people were afraid of dying. They hadn't said so. But Yi Shiwen knew that it was definitely so. Otherwise, it would be absolutely impossible for them to wait until now as per their conceited nature. Everyone had waited until several crafty people like them arrived. This proved that they had fear in their heart. This was enough for Yi Shiwen to understand that they wouldn't fight him one-on-one. Kill Yi Shiwen. Snatch his treasures, and well get those 500 million primary spirit dawn in return. A Xianyuan Palace Hall's disciple said. The Xianyuan Palace Hall and the 10,000 Beasts Villa had together made the declaration about the reward. However, it wasn't these disciples who would have to pay that reward. Instead, the forces behind them had to do so. Therefore, these disciples were also longing for those 500 million primary spirit dawn. They didn't want to let this opportunity go. This was the best chance to kill Yi Shiwen for all of these mighty heroes. His words seemed like an order since everyone who had evil intentions for Yi Shiwen had attacked. Xianyuan Palace Hall, 10,000 Beasts Villa, 100 Barbarians Cave, Fire Clouds Cave, and Northern Barbarian Shaman School. Several top disciples of all of the illustrious forces of the true martial world, who together deterred the true martial university, had attacked commutatively. Countless attacks swept out. Countless martial art attacks shattered the void. This scene was as terrifying as the dreadful scene of Doomsday. Nobody had ever witnessed such a situation. It would be normal if two forces collaborated to deal with a person. However, such a situation where so many experts had collaborated to deal with just one person was unprecedented. On top of that one person was merely an expert of the sage accomplished realm. A person like Yi Shiwen who had challenged everyone to attack together had never appeared in the past. So, everyone had reckoned that it would be highly unlikely for such a person to appear in the future as well. The legends about this fight would be spread even after many years. The experts who hadn't attacked just now and were just watching would spread the legends of this dreadful fight. This battle was like Doomsday. It was like the Dusk of Gods. It was like a huge disaster. It was extremely terrifying. The endless void had transformed into dust within a split second. Everyone who was witnessing this scene was incomparably terrified. Several experts had attacked together. It wasn't a great sage level attack. However, even a great sage would have escaped in fear if they had come across such might. After all, they would have eventually gotten transformed into fragments of fragments if they hadn't escaped. Bang! The protection of golden divinities on Yi Ziwen's body got crushed and transformed into fragments by these attacks. This was just as everyone had expected. Then, the attack struck Yi Ziwen's body, and it seemed as if his entire body would be crushed into pieces in a split second. Even a great sage would have died whilst facing such dreadful attacks. Yi Shiwen was blown away. He spouted mouthful of blood, and fell into the endless chaotic space. His condition looked incomparably miserable at the moment. It seemed as if he would die in the very next moment. Those outstanding heroes felt a chill running down their spines, especially those who hadn't attacked. They saw that Yi Shiwen had been blown away in the first strike. So, they believed that he would certainly not be able to withstand the following blows. In fact, it would be a miracle if he withstood even 3 such strikes. Many people bewailed, "So can nobody accomplish this feat? Is it impossible to challenge all the outstanding heroes of the world at the same time?" This force was gigantic and dreadful. A large amount of power was combined together. At least 300 or 400 top-tier experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm had joined hands to attack at once. Yi Shiwen, you're screwed. You're a bane to my Xianyuan Palace Hall. Too many experts of my Xianyuan Palace Hall have died at your hands. Today is the day you die. You must pay the debt of blood with blood. You'll die without a burial ground. Fang Lung took the initiative and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. He was holding a big hatchet in his hand. This was a terrifying martial technique of the Xianyuan Palace Hall Xianyuan God's hatchet. It had been comprehended from the myths of a legendary god. It was extremely terrifying. It was also Xianyuan Palace Hall's primary martial technique. Every martial technique of the Xianyuan Palace Hall had originated from this technique. In fact, that was how the Xianyuan Palace Hall had gotten its name. There was a big connection between its name and this martial technique. His big hatchet rose against the wind. It then grew bigger and bigger. It didn't delay. It smashed down like lightning and split open the space. It seemed as if it would finally strike Yi Ziwen's body. Yi Shiwen, who was still flying in midair, opened his eyes at this time. His eyes emitted incredible rays of light. The dim golden rays of light that had been present on his body earlier suddenly erupted just like great waves. That dreadful attack from a moment ago seemed nothing in comparison to this eruption. Fang Lung was left dumbstruck. Then he became alarmed. Is this Yi Ziwen's trap? He didn't feel it was so. So he thought once again. This is impossible. Nobody can survive while facing such an attack. I would have been torn into pieces if I had been in his place. Even a great sage can't withstand such an attack. Yi Ziwen's performance is remarkable. He wasn't reduced to dust on the spot by the attack. However, it is certainly impossible that he wouldn't have sustained any injuries. However, Yi Shiwen didn't give him time to respond. He suddenly brandished his fist. Fang Lung didn't get time to think much. So he quickly unleashed his top technique within a split second. He held his hatchet even more tightly and pushed his power to the max. His tall figure grew even taller as he stood between the heaven and the earth. He appeared like a mythical god who had split open the world and had wanted to cut open a path through the chaos. It was incomparably dreadful. It seemed as if his hatchet would even cut the world into two halves. However, Yi Shiwen had already arrived in front of him and attacked. The entire void swayed under his ferocious step. The endless devil energy present in the surroundings suddenly began to boil, as if it were roaring because of his big bang stardust fist. Bang! The entire world suddenly boiled and cracked. It trembled because of this dreadful collision. Poof! A stream of blood splashed across the blue sky. Then a figure went out flying upside down. It was Fang Lung. Everyone was staring blankly at this scene before their eyes. They seemed to have been left dumbstruck. Yi Shiwen had looked to be in an incomparably pitiful condition a moment ago. But he had blown away Fang Lung in just one fist now. Chapter 633. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they saw this scene before their eyes. Had Yi Shiwen already planned it? He hasn't sustained any injury. Had everything been a plan to trick everyone? It looked so. He was extremely terrifying if it was true. But it wasn't so because of his plan. After all, these small schemes were nothing for these people. What was so dreadful was the might required for this plan. Even a great sage would have been ripped apart by such a dreadful joint attack. However, Yi Shiwen had survived it. Moreover, he hadn't sustained any injury. This was extremely terrifying. Yi Shiwen didn't stop after he had blown away Fang Lung in one fist. He continued to chase him. In fact, all this wasn't any trap in reality. His strength wasn't too tyrannical either. The fact was that his Phoenix regeneration technique was extremely tyrannical. He could restore to his peak condition as long as his body hadn't fallen apart. Fang Lung's speed had been extremely fast a moment ago. Yi Shiwen hadn't restored to his peak condition yet. However, he had already recovered enough to fight him. Yi Shiwen was now pursuing Fang Lung. He had had just an instant. However, he had already taken advantage of this short period of time and had restored to the peak. The dreadful aura swept out and rose to the sky. This indicated that Yi Shiwen was in his most peak condition. Phoenix regeneration technique was extremely powerful. This was also a reason because of which he had dared to challenge several experts at once. He hadn't thought that he could provoke several experts at the same time and not get injured as per his strength. He was sure that he would sustain injuries. However, he could quickly recover as long as he didn't get blasted on the spot. That's why he had dared to do something so unprecedented. Any other person in his place would have been ripped apart on the spot even if they had more tyrannical strength than him. Yi Shiwen had already prepared for his safety since he had provoked them on the spot. He had challenged them after he had had assurance. Only a real powerhouse could pull this off. He had gone up so boldly. Only a mad genius could think of it. Yi Shiwen. You. How is it possible? Feng Lung looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen, who had been blown away a moment ago, had now blown him away in one fist. He was convinced that he hadn't been mistaken. After all, Yi Shiwen had sustained serious injuries and had almost died. There was just half-second left. That's why he had taken the initiative and attacked. He wanted to take the lead and kill Yi Shiwen in order to re-establish the Xianyuan Palace Hall's supreme prestige before everyone. The Xianyuan Palace Hall had become a big joke for everyone because Li Yifeng had been effortlessly killed by Yi Shiwen. Li Yifeng had vowed to kill the culprit, but he himself was annihilated by Yi Shiwen instead. The Xianyuan Palace Hall would become an enormous joke if Feng Lung didn't make sure that Yi Shiwen was dead. Moreover, he needed to kill Yi Shiwen with his own hands. This was intolerable for any disciple of the Xianyuan Palace Hall, who was ambitious for the position of the Lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. Therefore, he just had to take the initiative and kill Yi Shiwen first. However, his attempt had been thoroughly ruined by Yi Shiwen now. Yi Shiwen hadn't become weak. In fact, he was much stronger than what Feng Lung had imagined. He was already exhausted. Still, he had blown Feng Lung away in one fist. Such strength could be considered as incomparably terrifying. I told you that today is the day you die. It seemed from Yi Zaiwen's ice-cold voice, as if he was talking about something that had nothing to do with him. The Big Bang Stardust fist suddenly smashed down. Bang! Feng Lung's body was exploded by the Big Bang Stardust fist. The defensive divine tools on his body were also blown to smithereens as this happened. Even his body had been disintegrated by Yi Shiwen. Yi Zaiwen's body emitted blood light at this time. Feng Lung's corpse was absorbed along with the fragments of his divine tools. Yi Shiwen, I've already entered the most crucial time of becoming a great sage tool. I need a great amount of flesh and fragments of divine tools to accelerate my evolution. Yi Mo's voice reverberated in Yi Zaiwen's mind, and Yi Shiwen immediately became pleasantly surprised upon hearing this. Yi Mo had fallen into deep sleep several days ago after reaching to the most crucial stage, since he wanted to put his entire effort into evolving into a great sage tool. Yi Shiwen hadn't expected that Yi Mo would suddenly wake up at this crucial moment. However, Yi Shiwen promptly nodded. After all, Yi Mo needed it. So he would put his life on stake to accomplish this. Moreover, the people in front of him were his enemies. After all, they were coveting those 500 million primary spirit dawn, or wanted to climb up whilst treating him as their stepping stone. They wanted to become famous through one fight after intercepting and killing him. It was extremely deplorable. It took too much time to explain. But everything had obviously happened very quickly. Feng Lung had been defeated by Yi Shiwen only in a flash, and he had instantly died. The spectators were left dumbstruck by everything that had occurred before their eyes. In fact, they were staring blankly. After all, they hadn't expected that they would see such a scene. Feng Lung was the topmost expert, but he was annihilated like this in two fists. Everything seemed extremely unimaginable. However, it looked very normal after they thought about it carefully. Yi Shiwen truly had such strength. Aguda had also been killed by him like this earlier. The other experts' attacks also arrived at this time, and Yi Shiwen was once again blown away by the attacks just like earlier. People had also thought that Yi Shiwen was truly dead earlier. However, they had received a tight slap on their faces in the end, and they didn't dare to make such a judgment now. That's because the result of such a judgment was that Yi Shiwen had taken advantage of their negligence and had killed Feng Lung. Some people had disdain in their hearts. They were already determined that this was Yi Zaiwen's trap to attract some people. However, he had already used this trap a moment ago, and he was thinking to use it once again now. So, how could they be fooled once again? Nobody dared to rush up and launch an attack on Yi Shiwen after learning from Fong Ling's tragic fate a moment ago. This was just as expected. Their worries had also bought Yi Shiwen the most crucial time to recover. Yi Shiwen stood up. His slim figure appeared tall and straight while facing all the mighty experts of the human race. However, nobody dared to look down upon him because of his ordinary appearance. He appeared like a world-famous god of war in this moment. He looked unrivaled and extremely dreadful. The surrounding place turned quiet wherever his eyes went. All of you who want to kill me will perish today. Yi Zaiwen's loud voice didn't have a thread of fluctuation. These people have greatly underestimated me. They think that they can obtain the reward after killing me. However, nobody has dared to challenge me alone. I would have a whole new level of respect for them if they were like Buluo. Yi Shiwen forced into the army of experts after saying this. A golden light flickered and he rushed in. His speed was extremely fast. Many experts didn't get enough time to respond, and he had already rushed inside the group. He was also inside this group. So they were hesitating even if they wanted to attack. It had become impossible for them to attack unscrupulously like they had moments ago. This was also what Yi Zaiwen's goal was. He didn't need to be worried about his life even if he sustained injuries occasionally as long as they couldn't attack him unscrupulously. After all, he also knew that these experts were extremely dreadful. In fact, almost half of the entire experts of the true martial world had gathered here. Even a great sage would die if he came under their combined attack. He had almost died a moment ago. Fortunately, it was just almost, and he had gotten enough time to recover. Bang! An expert didn't get enough time to react, and Yi Zaiwen's fist had already smashed him. Each expert was easily killed by just Yi Zaiwen's one fist. Then their bodies disintegrated in the sky, and were absorbed by his heavenly source mirror within a split second. It transformed them into a kind of nourishment that could accelerate the process of becoming a great sage tool. Friends, we are still slow. We must attack quickly. This man is incomparably fierce. He's vicious and merciless. His strength is incomparably tyrannical. It'll be impossible to match him if we don't join hands. An expert finally spoke up in a fearful tone. Yi Shiwen seemed immortal to these people. The combined attacks of so many people couldn't affect him. This was like an insurmountable barrier. Moreover, this barrier was killing them. Yi Shiwen would kill them if they didn't unite. They would only be killed by him if they waited any further. They were already doomed when they had arrived to kill Yi Shiwen in order to obtain those 500 million primary spirit dawn. This thought had flashed past their minds. However, they hadn't anticipated at that time that Yi Shiwen would force them into such a desperate situation on his own. Yi Zaiwen's speed was incomparably fast. He had already killed 5 or 6 top-tier experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. His efficiency was extremely high. He was treating these people as small and weak creatures, just like a rare genius of a generation. A loud shout entered everyone's ears at this time. You people don't need to worry. He isn't immortal. He has just cultivated a powerful healing technique, and nothing more. This isn't any secret in the true martial university. Everyone shot a glance. This man was the young barbarian king of the 100 Barbarians cave. He hadn't moved until now. He hadn't attacked yet. Instead, he had been observing Yi Zaiwen's trick. He just thought that he might not be able to catch Yi Shiwen even if he attacked. Countless people had been fighting. However, he had gotten the opportunity to see through Yi Zaiwen's trick. Yi Shiwen has been blown away twice and has sustained serious injuries. This is fact. I've seen it with my own eyes. So I can't be mistaken. He might have been wrong the first time, but he had confidence that he couldn't make the mistake the second time. Then there is only one possibility. He has cultivated some incredible healing technique. A greedy look flashed in his eyes as he thought this. Chapter 634. Which martial arts cultivator didn't have a healing divine technique? After all, nobody could say that they would never sustain injuries. One must recover within a short time if they had sustained injuries. This had become an essential thing for all experts. And it was already shocking if someone could recover to this extent within a few breaths. How could others figure out what the young barbarian king had thought? After all, he was a mighty influential figure among the core disciples. He was a famous person who was just one step away from the great sage realm. Their eyes were brimming with greed as they looked at Yi Shiwen after they thought this. Yi Shiwen certainly can't have such strength without countless adventures under his belt. He must have innumerable treasures and magical powers. We might rise above others if we can rob even some of those treasures. On the other side, in another microcosm, countless visions were fixed on the merit list. A group of divine senses were locked upon the merit list, so that they could quickly find out any change in the merit list. Moreover, all the mighty experts who were present here had used all kinds of methods, and had found out that a stunning battle was going on in the devil world. The true martial university's Yi Shiwen had challenged all the experts alone. It was a scary fight. It was an exceptional fight which had surpassed all the other fights of its kind before and since. Nobody had dared to challenge so many experts like this apart from Yi Shiwen. None of the mighty experts present here could think of provoking everyone even if they were the scariest experts of the true martial world. Even if they could set off an earthquake with the stamp of their feet. This was as if someone among them had abruptly spoken and challenged everyone else. One must know that Yi Shiwen hadn't challenged the weaker experts. Nobody's realm was lower than his among all the experts who had surrounded him. So these people believed that either he was insane, or he had some backup. That's why he had done so. Some people believed that Yi Shiwen was insane, while others believed that he certainly had some support. Yi Shiwen is insane. Such an expert rarely appears in the true martial university. But I'm afraid that he'll also fall quickly now. Awesome. Ha ha ha. He truly deserves to be a disciple of my true martial university. He has enough courage. I wasn't so courageous back in the day. The divine senses of many people were firmly locked upon the merit list. They were paying attention to the names that were changing in the merit list. A lot of changes had occurred. Some people had been killed by the devils, and the rankings of some people on the merit list had increased unceasingly after killing the devil experts. However, they weren't paying attention to these changes. Dead. Feng Lung is dead. Someone suddenly shouted, and everyone's gaze fell onto the merit list. Feng Lung's name had been somewhat near the top where everyone could see it just in a glance. Everyone saw it now. Feng Lung's name had been omitted from the merit list. And so, the expert behind him had moved up by one rank. The mood of all the experts from the Xianyuan Palace Hall sank as they saw this scene. The Xianyuan Palace Hall might not have been wiped out from this devil world competition with Feng Lung's and Li Yifeng's death. However, there wasn't much difference between getting wiped out and the death of these two supreme core disciples in succession. The true martial university's enemies were under the entire sky. However, the Xianyuan Palace Hall's condition wasn't good either. After all, the true martial university was consistently trying to restore their former glory in the true martial world. However, other forces were also trying to replace it. Countless years of dispute had given rise to immense hatred between these forces. So, how could they not throw stones at others who had fallen when they had gotten such an opportunity? Everyone was left dumbstruck. They hadn't anticipated that this could be the situation. Yi Shiwen hadn't died. On the contrary, the Xianyuan Palace Hall's Feng Lung had died first. Another group of experts had been fighting with him. However, they had also been killed along with him. Yi Shiwen, it's your last day today. You won't get the opportunity to escape. Several experts had decided. Those who were coveting Yi Ziwen's treasures and magical powers hooted one after another. They had already gone crazy in this moment. There was no one among them who didn't want to rob Yi Shiwen. A dreadful war had begun like this in the devil world. These people crazily attacked Yi Shiwen to kill him. And Yi Shiwen had also burst into these outstanding heroes. The entire world trembled under the fluctuations of the attacks of the several hundred dreadful experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. Many people believed that Yi Ziwen's action of breaking into the crowd was equal to following the path of one's own doom. Nobody could save him. However, it wasn't so in his opinion. Even a great sage would be ripped apart under the combined attack of so many experts. Therefore, he mustn't give them an opportunity to attack together. So he had burst into the crowd instead. He was surrounded by people from all directions. However, it was an enormous safety for him because they couldn't attack unscrupulously because other people were also present around him. A golden light fluctuated inside the crowd at a flying speed. An expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm died at Yi Zaiwen's hands every time it disappeared and appeared. Everyone was rushing towards him like madmen, and was getting killed within no time. Smell of blood pervaded the sky, and whoever smelt it felt like vomiting. The smell was from Yi Zaiwen's blood, and the blood of his defeated enemies. Yi Shiwen faced less attacks because of rushing into the crowd. However, dreadful attacks still unceasingly struck his body. An ordinary person would have already died on the spot by now. However, it was Yi Shiwen. His body was extremely tough. It wasn't possible to kill him on the spot, since he could soon recover with the help of the Phoenix regeneration technique. That's why he had survived till now. Otherwise, an ordinary person would have already died and disintegrated by now if they had been in his place. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't avoid injuries either. Sometimes, the wounds were so deep that his bones were clearly visible and blood had splashed out. He had continuously sustained injuries. However, his fighting prowess and imposing aura unceasingly grew stronger and stronger. The flesh and blood of those experts who had been blown up by him were absorbed by his heavenly source mirror, while their wealth was seized by him. These experts weren't as rich as him. However, they had already entered the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. Each individual might have had as much as 10 million primary spirit dawn. So the total wealth would reach to an astronomical amount. Moreover, he had burnt even more primary spirit dawn, and had instilled them into his body in order to support the consumption. He had the support of the primary spirit dawn. However, he couldn't avoid injuries while facing the assault of so many experts. Anyway, the consumed primary spirit dawn were getting replenished at an astonishing rate. The primary spirit dawn were being consumed at every moment. However, he could at least seize 1 million primary spirit dawn from all those he had killed. And this amount was pretty good. After all, many little drops make an ocean. Therefore, this was also a huge treasure in a way. It was even more so in his opinion. However, those experts attacked him even more madly. They had so far just heard that Yi Shiwen had some extremely formidable healing technique. But they had now seen how many times Yi Shiwen was blown away by their combined attacks, but had tenaciously made comebacks, and soon recovered to the peak condition. His imposing aura was getting restored to the most peak condition at a speed visible to the naked eye. Moreover, anyone with eyes could see how formidable his body was. An ordinary person would have been blown up to smithereens long ago. However, his body hadn't blown up. Such physical strength was truly shocking. This had given them another reason to kill Yi Shiwen. After all, who wouldn't want to barge into an army like this? Dead. The war has just begun, and my God, they've fallen so soon. It's like one person is dying every second. Countless people looked at the merit list. They wanted to see what was happening. However, astral wind was blowing in that chaotic battlefield. The void was shattered into pieces, and the chaos had leaked out. So the divine senses couldn't explore the battlefield in this situation. Many people didn't know what was happening there. They could only judge what was happening inside by looking at the change of names on the merit list. However, one thing was certain. Nothing had happened to Yi Shiwen. He was still tenaciously fighting. His name was still there on the merit list. His name was still behind 1,000 names. However, everyone's divine sense was locked upon his name on the merit list. In fact, countless pairs of eyes were fixed on his name. Yi Zaiwen's name was fluctuating. Sometimes it would get dim, while sometimes it would emit incredible rays of light. However, the names of one or a few experts were erased from the merit list every time his name emitted incredible rays of light. What kind of terrifying scene was this? My God! Yi Shiwen is against heaven's will. He'll certainly have a place among the core disciples of the true martial world if he survives. The complexion of an expert standing in the circle turned deathly pale as he said. He was almost scared to death after watching such this world-shaking fight before his eyes. He and Yi Shiwen were equals. Both of them were in the sage-accomplished realm. However, he was nothing in a place like this which was filled with the experts of half-step great sage realm. Therefore, he hadn't dared to approach. He wasn't tempted even if many people had incited him to kill Yi Shiwen and rob his divine weapons and wealth. Are you kidding me? Is it that easy to deal with Yi Shiwen? Many people had seen with their own eyes how a Buddha had died back then. Moreover, he knew this well that Yi Shiwen's stuff wouldn't fall into his hands, even if they managed to kill him. Dead. All are dead. So many experts have died at one person's hands. This news will shake the entire true martial world when it transmits outside. Someone cried out in alarm. His complexion had turned deathly pale after watching this war before his eyes. It has already caused a sensation in the true martial world. I reckon our forces must have also obtained this news by now. Anyway, Yi Shiwen has become famous in the entire true martial world this time. He'll certainly become an extremely terrifying person if he survives. In fact, the true martial world scene might change after several hundred years because of him. Chapter 635. This news spread out more widely as Yi Shiwen continued to slaughter. Even those experts who hadn't been paying attention to this matter had started paying attention to it in the end, because of the changes that had occurred on the merit list. After all these people were experts of the late stage of half-step great sage realm. They were elites among elites in every force. All of them had reached the top 1,000 positions on the merit list. They weren't as incredible as the top 10 individuals on the merit list. They weren't as well known either. However, they were still top-tier experts in comparison to those ordinary core disciples of Sage Realm. So they definitely deserved respect. However, these experts had now fallen one after another just like dumplings. And their names had been erased from the merit list. Even many top 100 rankers were wiped out, and their names disappeared. There were some experts who hadn't paid attention to this matter earlier, or didn't know what was happening because they had been in closed-door training. However, they looked at the sky in astonishment for a moment. What is happening? How is it possible? Several disciples of the True Martial University were also nervously looking at the merit list in the True Martial University's Devil World encampment. The fact that Yi Shiwen had challenged several outstanding heroes had shaken the entire world. They also knew that they must stand on Yi Shiwen's side at this time no matter whether Yi Shiwen looked pleasing to their eyes or not. Their hearts palpitated as they watched Yi Shiwen's name getting dim one moment and dazzling in the next. And many names got obliterated from the merit list as Yi Shiwen's name fluctuated from time to time. Many people couldn't help but hold their breaths as they saw this scene before their eyes. They hadn't gone to the battlefield to see in person. However, they could imagine how intense this fight must be by just looking at the names of a large number of outstanding leading individuals getting erased from the merit list. So many have died so quickly. Many names have been wiped out in a split second. Their bodies and souls have been entirely extinguished. Yi Shiwen must be the one to do this. All these people are the essential part of every force. And all of them have died now. All are dead. Bai Jingwei was left dumbstruck as he saw this scene. The core disciples could be weighed as elites inside a force. They were the most important part of a force. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called as core disciples. Especially, those who had participated in the Devil World competition were elites among elites. And the experts of late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm were even more so. In fact, they were the cream among the core disciples. But they had lost at Yi Shiwen's hands this time. So, it could be said that a lot of forces must have received a major blow. He also thought that Yi Shiwen must have some support since he had dared to challenge several experts. That he must be sure that he wouldn't get defeated, and also wouldn't die by the attacks. However, he hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen would slaughter them in such a terrifying way. The names that symbolized a person's existence would be erased in front of countless eyes. His speed is even more dreadful. I've never doubted his strength. I knew from the time when he had killed a Buddha that his strength was unfathomable. He must be more formidable than me. However, the crucial point lies in his speed. He has managed to kill so many experts within such a short time. What kind of dreadful strength and speed does he possess? Gao Lingxiu frowned and said. She could say that she had seen Yi Shiwen growing up. Yi Shiwen had killed young Master Jin Xiu when she had seen him not too long ago. However, she could tell that young Master Jin Xiu and Yi Shiwen had been on the same level at that time. He could at most contend against the experts of initial stage of half-step Great Sage Realm. However, so many experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm had died at his hands now. In fact, he had slaughtered them just like dogs. Good. He has done outstanding service for our university by killing so many elites of every big force. He may have committed some sins in the past, but he can be forgiven. Fan Yicheng was present beside these two individuals. But he also softly spoke up at this time. His tone was still ice-cold. However, it wasn't ice-cold to a terrifying extent as earlier. His words naturally showed the resentment between Yi Shiwen and the law enforcement hall. This kind of scene wasn't limited to the devil world. It had exploded like a pot even in that mysterious microcosm. Several mighty lords stood up from their seats in shock. It seemed as if someone had poked the hornet's nest. These experts wouldn't have any expression on their faces on ordinary days. But they had lost their control at this time, and had started to groan like madmen. The forces which had enmity with the true martial university were even more so. Some of the experts who had surrounded Yi Shiwen were longing for his treasures and wealth. Some had even obtained instruction from their sects to eliminate Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen had become a thorn in the eyes of many forces after he had gone and killed Shoukuan, Li Feng. A good at all Yi Shiwen had won the martial arts championship that had taken place between the four forces in the past. But that hadn't caused any major sensation. After all, many experts believed that it was just another low-level competition among juniors which took place every 100 years. Therefore, they believed that Yi Shiwen couldn't pose any threat to them even if he had won the championship. However, this situation was different. Yi Shiwen had already displayed astonishing strength and tricks. So they couldn't ignore his growth anymore. They wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to eliminate him if he had just been tangled among the experts of the true martial university. However, he had challenged the outstanding heroes of the entire world now. So, this was a fair opportunity for them to kill him. Therefore, these forces had sent their most elite disciples in the Devil World competition to encircle and annihilate him. This operation was different from the single-aimed operation of those people who were longing for Yi Ziwen's wealth. After all, these people worked in an organized manner. This was the biggest opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen. However, it had somehow turned into the biggest tragedy for them. They had almost gotten mad with anger as they saw the names of their disciples being erased one by one. After all, this symbolized that their disciples were dead. They issued heaven-shaking roars one after another. They wanted to kill Yi Shiwen in anger. They wouldn't mind killing Yi Shiwen in a slap if he appeared in front of them. They wouldn't mind killing this bastard. Those disciples were elites. They were their favorites. They weren't as precious as true disciples. In fact, the death of a few such experts wasn't a big thing. However, it wasn't easy to groom such geniuses. And they had died one by one now. How wouldn't it have made them scream in grief? It had obviously made them mad. Perhaps they would have rushed into the devil world if all the forces hadn't imposed the restriction on interference in the matters of the devil world, and didn't have tacit understanding with the devil world. They would have then found Yi Shiwen and twisted his neck like a twig. It could be said that a knife had pierced their hearts along with every individual's death. It had been taken out thereafter. But the knife had gradually inscribed a name in their hearts, Yi Shiwen. The man whom they viewed as an ant was now rooted incomparably deep in the hearts of all these mighty lords, so much so that they were even willing to eat his flesh raw. Dreadful killing intentions recklessly flew out in the sky. The weakest among them were the overlords of Great Sage Realm. Dreadful killing intentions were unscrupulously unleashed. It even seemed as if the entire microcosm wouldn't be able to bear such dreadful pressure, and would definitely collapse. This kid can't be left alive. He must be killed. Otherwise, he'll become a huge threat for us. The lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall clenched his teeth and said. He obviously didn't think that Yi Shiwen could pose any threat to him at present. However, he might grow up into a dreadful expert in the future after several hundred years. The possibility of Xianyuan Palace Hall ruling the entire true martial world could become non-existent if there would be another such expert in the true martial university. Many mighty lords around him also nodded and showed their consent to the words of the Lord of Xianyuan Palace Hall. They had also sent many experts to kill Yi Shiwen. However, all of them had died at his hands now. So these lords hated Yi Ziwen's guts and were willing to kill him with their own hands. They were regretting it deep down now. My goodness! Why did you have to involve the disciples into this matter? You must look for an opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen. Find a great sage to get rid of him, isn't so? After all, it looks far more reasonable than any other way. Moreover, many mighty lords who hadn't seen their disciples dying were hopeful. My sect's disciples should know what is difficult to handle. They mustn't jump into this madness after being fooled by greed. Ha 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 ha. Heaven is protecting my true martial university. Such powerful disciples have appeared generation after generation. Yi Shiwen is a God-gifted genius. Nobody can have such a record of challenging so many experts and still succeeding in killing them. Some people lamented, while some were excited endlessly. The true martial university's disciples were naturally laughing in excitement in comparison to those extremely depressed disciples of other forces. The stronger Yi Shiwen would become, the more benefits the true martial university would obtain, and they would naturally be even happier. It's obvious that Yi Shiwen will become famous in the entire world after this fight, if he can survive. An expert of the true martial university said anxiously. Other experts also became quiet as they thought of this. We mustn't focus on the fact that the names of several experts have been erased from the merit list. It's still nothing compared to their huge number. Even Yi Shiwen might not have imagined such a scene. They could see it from the fluctuation of his name. What level of characters were they that they could even see through the devil world? They could judge what the present situation of a person would be just looking at the change in the luster of their name. It's not good. It's the young barbarian king of the 100 Barbarians Cave now. His name has suddenly become dim. And the names of a few disciples of the 100 Barbarians Cave have also been omitted. Someone suddenly blurted out in shock. Some people's gaze suddenly fell onto the merit list. They saw that the name of the 100 Barbarians Cave's young barbarian king was getting dimmer and dimmer. Meanwhile, a loud explosion occurred in the devil world, and young barbarian king was blown away by Yi Ziwen's punch. Chapter 636. Chapter 636. Are you all really going to watch someone die? And Yi Shiwen felt that his heavenly source mirror was transforming at an astonishing speed. In fact, an astonishing change was occurring every second. Transforming into a great sage tool was an enormous transformation. It could be said that it would be like reaching heaven in a single bound after this transformation. One would lay the foundation for the later stages until the legendary realm, be it martial cultivator or divine tools. And the process of transformation would begin from the sage realm. The so-called cultivation was constantly improving oneself. One would begin to break away from the category of ordinary lives from the legendary realm. And the so-called rising to the heaven for the divine tools was this kind of transformation. In fact, making a breakthrough into a great sage tool from a sage tool was the most difficult breakthrough until that point. Yi Shiwen and the heavenly source mirror were closely related. The more it would transform and become stronger, the stronger he would become as well. This was like complementing each other. The heavenly source mirror itself could fend off many attacks, as it would grow stronger and stronger. This would reduce the chances of him sustaining injuries. So he could exhibit its true divine power once it would make the breakthrough and become a great sage tool. Even common great sages didn't have a great sage tool, let alone these experts of late stage of half-step great sage realm. In fact, it was impossible for them to display the entire might of a great sage tool even if they possessed a damaged one. However, Yi Shiwen was different. He had Yimo's full strength coordination. Therefore, he could display the entire might as long as he kept consuming the primary spirit dawn. He and the heavenly source mirror had already reached the point of merging into each other, like water and milk. In fact, it was almost an extended portion of his body. Other people couldn't accomplish something like this. Everyone thought that he had already gone all out. However, he himself believed that he hadn't started to feast yet. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes and looked at the young barbarian king. He had been blown far away by his one fist. The killing intention was flickering in Yi Ziwen's eyes. This young barbarian king is one of those people who are harboring malicious intentions for me. Yi Shiwen obviously wouldn't let off the young barbarian king and his subordinates after he had seen that they were plotting to kill him. He didn't know that the disciples of many forces had obtained the news from their sects to encircle and annihilate him. However, he could see that some people were harboring evil intentions for him. The only way to deal with such people was to annihilate them. This was the best solution. Yi Shiwen stepped forward. Nobody could stop him. He appeared in front of the young barbarian king in an instant. Suddenly, the young barbarian king made a move, and the space surged about. Then, a huge finger arrived whilst breaking the sky. 100 Barbarians' Luren fingers. It was a martial technique of the 100 Barbarians' cave. Yi Shiwen had come across this technique in the past. However, only a semi-sage expert had used it at that time. Therefore, the real might of the 100 Barbarians' Luren fingers technique wasn't demonstrated. However, the young barbarian king was just a step away from the great sage realm, and he had used it in this instance. So it displayed incredible might. Just a finger had broken the world and transformed it into chaos. It seemed as if everything in the world had broken down, and an incredible hurricane was set off. Yi Shiwen shot a punch, and it transformed into a big star. It then transformed into a profound star, and exploded on that huge finger, even though the finger was like a giant pillar supporting the sky. The dreadful barbarian energies which had arrived whilst breaking through the space, exploded on Yi Ziwen's hand one after another. They then cut open his golden divinities, and issued incredible buzzing sounds. However, it was soon concealed by the divinity waves emitted from his body. It couldn't cause much impact on him. Yi Ziwen's fist seemed to be metal cast. No attack could shake his incredible body. A horrifying power began to boil on Yi Ziwen's body, and those barbarian energies were wiped out in an instant. The huge finger also began to break up in the sky. A muffled groan came from the young barbarian king's side. Blood was dripping from his finger, and the bones were almost broken. His eyes were filled with astonishment as he looked at Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if he was looking at a monster. One must know that his body was the barbarian god's real body that was mentioned in the legends. The barbarian god's real body could even blow up the vault of the heaven. Barbarian god's real body was barbarian god's very own body and physique in the fables. It was a confidential technique. However, the fire cloud cave possessed it. Moreover, even a few forces of the southern wilderness had methods of cultivating the barbarian god's real body. After all of them had initially split up from barbarian god's temple, which had been the most authentic and topmost force of its time. The most outstanding disciples of each generation of these forces of southern wilderness could enjoy the benefits of transforming into the barbarian god's real body. He had never come across a more powerful body than his among his peers after undergoing the transformation into barbarian god's real body. He was like a humanoid T-Rex. He had even accomplished a feat like fighting with the demon beasts in terms of physical strength. However, he had now suffered a huge defeat while facing Yi Shiwen, who was a realm below him. Barbarian god's real body. Yi Shiwen had recognized this physique within a split second of contact. However, this wasn't the first time that he had come in contact with this physique. Qi Tian had also possessed such physique. It had been quite difficult for Yi Shiwen to defeat him in that fight. That battle was second only to the fight which he had had with Emperor Chen. So it was extremely difficult to deal with people who possessed such physiques. Young Barbarian King was countless times more powerful than Qi Tian. Qi Tian was already known to possess Barbarian God's real body back then. However, his physical transformation hadn't been completed. However, the body of young Barbarian King, who had already surpassed Sage Accomplished Realm, had made this transformation in its entirety. Therefore, the might displayed by him was also far more from what Qi Tian had displayed at that time. However, Yishuan wasn't an inexperienced youth like he had once been. After all, a decade's time was enough for him to grow up and become a person whom many people would look up to for a lifetime. Young Barbarian King had already felt that he was inferior to Yishuan. Moreover, his attacks couldn't cause any effect on Yishuan. He himself possessed an extremely tyrannical body. It could be said that he used to crush other people depending upon his body. Therefore, he knew well how troublesome a person with such tyrannical body could be. One finger breaks the world. Young Barbarian King didn't get time to think much. He could only attack Yishuan with his finger. He couldn't depend upon other people at this time. These people were as majestic as Yishuan had expected. However, all of them were harboring evil intentions. They wanted others to take the initiative. And then they wanted to sit back and enjoy the advantages like a fisherman after Yishuan had been killed by them. They didn't attack even when they saw that the young Barbarian King had been cornered by Yishuan. They wanted to kill Yishuan. However, they didn't have the strength to save someone from him. It must be said that there were disciples in the 100 Barbarians cave who were willing to die for the young Barbarian King. But they couldn't withstand even a single blow from Yishuan. Yishuan merely sneered while facing 100 Barbarians' Lu-Ren fingers, even though it had arrived while splitting the world. He then brandished his big hand. It was Fire Cloud Cave's martial technique, the Fire Cloud Cave's falling sky hand. It swept towards the 100 Barbarians' Lu-Ren fingers to grasp it. Bang! A dreadful power originated from the collision and emitted endless rays of light. These rays of light swept out over 1,000 miles. And the space broke down in its entirety. Many people in the surroundings were blown away by this power. They couldn't withstand such terrifying power. Bang! The young Barbarian King went out flying once again. He spouted a mouthful of blood. His eyes were filled with bitter hatred. Such an expression had appeared on his coarse face. So, it was evident that he hated Yishuan very much. Are you all going to watch someone die and do nothing to save them? You all will be killed one by this hunter if you don't attack. Your end won't be better than mine at that time. Young Barbarian King shouted in resentment. Many tyrannical auras were hidden in the crowd that had surrounded Yishuan, and nobody among them was weaker than him. However, they didn't attack this time. It seemed as if they wanted to watch from the sidelines. Young Barbarian King has said that all of us will be killed one by this monster if we don't kill him first. A figure came out of the void. It seemed as if this man's steps were setting off ripples as his figure walked in the void. He left imprints of principles while walking. He was very formidable. He was a dreadful person who had already stepped one foot into in the great sage realm. Everyone immediately recognized him. He is the top-tier expert of Eastern Region's Great Unity Sect Wuxia. The Great Unity Sect was a dreadful force. It was a colossus in the Eastern region. It was said that the Great Unity Sect wasn't a native force of the true martial world. They had entered the true martial world in large scale one day, and they had gotten the command over the Eastern region when the true martial university had declined. Thereupon, they had become one of the Eastern region's super-dominant forces. And Wuxia was the strongest person among the core disciples of the Great Unity Sect. He had already become famous in the entire true martial world. He also had the accomplishment of escaping unscathed from the hands of a great sage. He was regarded as one of the strongest experts in the half-step great sage realm. He was ranked third on the merit list. He was right below the member of the true martial university's Heavenly Punishment faction Fan Yicheng. Wuxia must be an even bigger pressure for Yishuan as compared to the young Barbarian King. He truly deserved to be ranked among the top 3 on the merit list. You're a strong man. However, you'll die here unfortunately. Wuxia looked at Yishuan somewhat pitifully and said, True Martial University has sent 2 formidable men this time. You're one and Fan Yicheng is the other. I'll go to that Fan Yicheng after I've killed you. The Heavenly Punishment faction had become famous in the true martial world when the true martial university was ruling the true martial world. So I'll go and see if they still have some standard. I'll see if they still deserve this reputation. Wuxia was carrying a faintly visible aura on his body. The Great Unity Sect didn't pursue an ordinary martial arts way. Instead, The so-called Great Unity Way was an entirely different martial way. Every disciple of the Great Unity sect carried a faintly visible aura. His provocative gaze apparently attempted to infuriate Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen himself didn't have good relations with the law enforcement hall. So he didn't mind whether the Heavenly Punishment faction deserved its reputation or not. Yi Shiwen sneered. He's gravely mistaken if he thinks that he can infuriate me in this way. Come on if you want to fight. Don't try to irritate me by using this method. It's pointless. Yi Shiwen softly replied. You're a fine man. But you're overconfident as well. We can't let you succeed in this matter. Otherwise, won't we all lose face? A sneer came from the void, and another tall figure came out walking from it. Why? Chapter 637. He was a tall man who was dressed like a barbarian. He unexpectedly looked slightly similar to the young barbarian king. He was the most tyrannical expert among the core disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave Qilin. Yi Shiwen had such an impression of him because he was Qi Tian's ancestor. In fact, Qi Tian's tribe had risen to the jurisdiction of several tribes of Fire Cloud Cave, because of Qilin. Qilin had soon become a core disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave, since he had risen above the others. In fact, his tribe had obtained many benefits after his emergence. More and more talents had taken birth in his tribe, and a top-tier powerhouse like Qi Tian was born later. However, it's a pity that he hadn't even grown up when he was killed by Yi Shiwen. The aura on Qilin's body had to be more overbearing than that on Qi Tian's body. It seemed as if the barbarian god had arrived from the ancient times. He was looking at Yi Shiwen with an ice-cold and hateful look in his eyes. Qi Tian was his most qualified descendant. He looked the most promising to take his position in the future among the core disciples. However, he didn't get time to support him further since he died at Yi Ziwen's hands. It was like someone had cut off the hope of their entire tribe's growth. He had supported his tribe by himself until now, and already brought it to the peak. And then, a successor like Qi Tian had appeared with great difficulties. However, he was killed by Yi Shiwen. So how wouldn't this man harbor immense hatred for Yi Shiwen? I think killing Yi Shiwen will prove my assassination path. Ha ha ha. The more tyrannical my kill, the more it'll prove my existence. The void distorted, and a figure appeared from inside it. This figure wore a cloak. He was slightly thin. Nobody could see how he looked and how tall he was. They just saw an eye-catching sickle in his hand. This sickle looked like it belonged to the god of death, Tianya's wind chaser. Someone recognized this man. This man was the core disciple of Tianya Group. This group was the biggest group of assassins in the true martial world. They could be found throughout the entire true martial world. The branches of the Tianya were also situated in the Great Yu State in the past. Jinglei had also been its disciple. He had set off a reign of terror in the Great Yu State once. But it wasn't clear how many experts had been killed by him. However, he had caused panic in the entire Great Yu State. He was just a disciple of the legendary realm. And it wasn't clear how much stronger this wind chaser was than Jinglei. As per the legends, this man had once audaciously gone to assassinate a great sage. He hadn't succeeded. However, he had escaped successfully. He had become famous after that fight, and had shaken the entire true martial world. He had soon become the top-notch expert among the core disciples of Tianya Group. The assassins of Tianya Group used to walk on a different path than the usual path of martial arts. They used to walk on the path of assassination. The result of cultivating quietly would be far inferior to the result produced through killing, especially on the path of assassination. The stronger the expert one would kill, the more breakthroughs they would make. Wind Chaser might already become a terrifying great sage assassin if he had succeeded in killing that great sage. Moreover, Wind Chaser was obviously the code name. Nobody would use their real name in the Tianya Group. In fact, there was no need to use real names either. Therefore, only code names remained. Another youth arrived after Wind Chaser. He was dressed in white clothes. People recognized him as soon as he arrived. This man was Xiang Baiyu. He was the top core disciple of Northern Region's No-Hate Temple. He looked as gentle as jade, like a person carved with jade. He was also an invincible expert among the core disciples of the northern region. He justified the so-called saying those with body like Bodhi are so high and aloof that it's difficult to reach them. Nobody among these 4 individuals was below the young barbarian king. In fact, they were slightly above him. They were a group of most powerful people under the great sage realm. The arrival of any of these individuals was enough to shake several experts. But so many people had surrounded Yi Shiwen in order to kill him. On the other side, the young barbarian king had taken the advantage of this time, and more than half of his injuries had healed. His complexion had turned extremely ugly. All these people were his rivals on ordinary days. So, they were well aware of each other. In fact, it wasn't clear how many times they had fought secretly while representing their respective forces. But he was in such a difficult situation in front of them at this time. How wouldn't he hate this? He hated these people in addition to the man who had humiliated him, Yi Shiwen. However, these people didn't know this. Otherwise, they might have killed the young barbarian king first. However, their visions were firmly fixed on only one individual, now Yi Shiwen. They were well aware of each other. After all, they had been rivals for more than 100 years. Therefore, they had maintained a balance between each other. They may have crossed stronger or weaker opponents amongst themselves. However, it wasn't that they couldn't handle the ones who were a bit stronger. However, Yi Shiwen had already surpassed the bottom line that they could take. The so-called sayings "the shot hits the bird that pokes its head out" and "big trees that rise above the forest are always destroyed by the wind" make sense. How would Yi Shiwen not know this truth? However, he didn't care about it. After all, big trees would be rooted more firmly and grow even healthier and stronger only if they faced the storms. They were intending to eradicate him since he had stood out among others. Then why wouldn't he think of using these people as his stepping stones? Ha 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 ha. Yi Shiwen, say whatever you want to say now. After all, this is the time of your death. Nobody can save you now. The young barbarian king wildly laughed. He had become confident that Yi Shiwen would die this time. You'll definitely die this time. This thing was bound to happen from the time when Qi Tian had died at your hands. I must tear you into pieces and avenge him. Qi Lin looked at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold eyes. A person like you shouldn't be allowed to live. Xiang Baiyu of northern regions No Hate Temple softly said. He meant that Yi Shiwen had destroyed the balance of power. So everyone had tacitly approved that such a character mustn't be allowed to go on. My sickle is getting impatient for your blood. Fufu, Wind Chaser coldly said. All of you come together. There's no need to look for any excuses. Not a single person among all of you should think of escaping. Yi Shiwen took a deep breath. His expression immediately turned incomparably serious. His vitality began to surge. After all, these few people had imposed a huge pressure on him. So it wasn't like earlier. His golden divinities emerged out. They formed golden waves, and swept out swirling in the air. Yi Ziwen's tone was dull. However, everyone felt as if they had fallen down into an ice cave. It seemed as if he was pronouncing their death penalties. Many experts who had surrounded him felt a chill inside at this time. Their eyes were brimming with killing intention as they looked at him. We can't let him live. Otherwise all of us will die. Even Zhuo Xiuzhu's complexion had turned exceptionally solemn. They didn't believe that Yi Shiwen could kill all of them by himself. However, it was easily possible that a few of them might serve as sacrificial victims. After all, how wouldn't they be aware how Shou Kuan and Aguda had died, and how young barbarian king had been forced into a difficult situation a moment ago? Therefore, they didn't take Yi Ziwen's words lightly. Yi Shiwen is extremely dangerous. He's only in the sage accomplished realm, and possesses such a terrifying strength. So, he'll grow up to an extremely dreadful extent if it continues like this. Such an unconventional person mustn't live. Duh. It wasn't clear who had shouted, but the entire world was flooded with the war cries. Yi Shiwen immediately felt as if a burst of fierce wind had hit his face. The murderous aura appeared suddenly. Whoosh. Suddenly, a black light arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. And it was none other than that Grim Reaper's sickle that charged swiftly towards his throat. It had already arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to kill him in this crucial moment. Its speed was beyond everyone's imagination. It was Wind Chaser. His assassination technique had already become profound to an incredible extent. His speed was incomparably fast. He had arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in an instant. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen didn't get enough time to react while facing Wind Chaser's killer blow, and it had already arrived near his neck. Everyone held their breath. Is Yi Shiwen going to die at Wind Chaser's hands? Wind Chaser apparently also felt that Yi Shiwen would soon die. Therefore, he couldn't help but let out a complacent laughter. Fufu, I want your head. Really? It's too early to be proud of yourself. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. Then, his body burst out endless golden light. The sword intention condensed in his hand, and then swept out. The sword intention exploded above that Grim Reaper's sickle, when only a fraction of time was left. Bang! Wind Chaser was blown away by Yi Shiwen. He went out flying just like a stringless kite. He didn't possess incredible physique. Therefore, he was blown away while facing Yi Shiwen, who was like a tyrannosaurus in the form of a human. I knew it. Blood dripped out from the corner of Wind Chaser's mouth. However, his face exposed an even more sinister look. You're powerful enough. You're a worthy prey. So it seems that I don't need to go and kill a great sage. I can also prove my path by killing you. Is that so? However, it seems to me that you deserve only to become a ghost under my sword. Yi Shiwen sneered. He brandished the long sword that was in his hand, and was about to rush over. The other 4 individuals, including other experts present in the surroundings, charged at this time. The other experts didn't have as dreadful strength as these 5 individuals. However, they didn't hold back their attacks on Yi Shiwen at this time. They couldn't let Yi Shiwen land a killer blow on Wind Chaser. Otherwise, it would be their turn next. A fiery big hand suddenly swept down from the sky. It was Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. It wasn't clear for how many years Qi Lin had cultivated the Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. He had already brought it to perfection. It seemed as if the void would collapse as it swept down. It seemed as if one palm would destroy 10,000 worlds. He himself seemed to have transformed into an ancient barbarian god. He seemed all set to rule the entire world. Yi Shiwen attacked with his longsword. The cold sword light divided into 19 sword lights. They ripped apart the world, and collided with that big hand in an instant. Bang! Endless rays of light emitted out, and gave rise to fluctuations. The sky distorted, and crashed down like a magnificent sea with a loud bang. It seemed as if the entire world had collapsed. That big hand was chopped off into several fragments by the sword light in the sky. It exploded in the sky, and opened a huge crack in the sky. The chaos leaked out. Qi Lin felt as if a tremendous power had transmitted to his hand. He had no choice but to retreat several steps in order to get away from this tremendous power. He was incomparably horrified in his heart. My arm would have gotten crushed if my body hadn't been a barbarian god's real body. Yi Zaiwen's swordlight is extremely dreadful. Chapter 638. How has Yi Zaiwen's body become so intrepid? The battle was still going on frantically. Yi Shiwen had repelled Qi Lin in a flash. However, Zhuo had already charged towards him. His sword lights were world-shaking. They weren't inferior to the sword lights that Yi Shiwen had produced a moment ago. A sword cut open the world, and smashed down. Zhuo's cultivation was topmost among all these individuals. It was enough to pose a threat to Yi Shiwen. After all, Yi Shiwen hadn't entered the Great Sage realm yet. He forced Yi Shiwen to give up the idea of chasing Qi Lin. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but get slightly anxious while facing Zhuo's attack. He had the assurance that he could blow up any of these 5 individuals in a one-on-one battle. However, he unfortunately seemed to be trapped in a net under the combined attack of these 5 people. The combined attack of these 5 men had imposed an even bigger pressure on Yi Shiwen, as compared to a moment ago when he was surrounded by densely packed enemies. Those 5 men were attacking in turns. Therefore, they didn't have any hesitation. Moreover, all of them had some mutual understanding. There wasn't a huge mutual understanding between them. However, it was much better as compared to earlier when Yi Shiwen had been dealing with a big crowd of experts. Zhuo's sword lights contained a kind of indistinct main dao. This was a kind of might sword dao. It was an unconventional sword technique. So, one could well imagine how ferocious it must be since it had given birth to sword dao. The sword lights blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they smashed down and shrouded Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if they would definitely kill him and turn him into fragments. Yi Shiwen promptly shot his big hand. He grabbed those endless sword lights with his fire clouds falling sky hand. Those sword lights crazily entangled on top of Yi Ziwen's big hand. It seemed as if they would explode his big hand just like he had exploded Qi Lin's fire clouds falling sky hand a moment ago. However, how could Yi Shiwen be so ordinary? He coldly snorted, and his entire divinities frantically rushed to his arm. Then, those frantically revolving sword lights were suppressed by the boundless divinities in a split second. His sword smashed down. It seemed as if it would chop off the horizon. However, it looked so childish in front of Yi Ziwen's fire clouds falling sky hand. On the other side, Qi Lin's complexion had turned exceptionally ugly. Their fire cloud cave's martial technique had displayed such might in Yi Ziwen's hands. It was obvious that it was a matter of extraordinary shame and humiliation for him. He could see that Yi Ziwen's fire clouds falling sky hand was more ferocious than his own. He couldn't imagine how Yi Shiwen might have cultivated the fire clouds falling sky hand to such a level. The fire clouds falling sky hand was widespread. However, it had some restrictions in practicing. Different level of people could learn different levels of fire clouds falling sky hand. Even he hadn't obtained the complete version of it. However, Yi Ziwen's fire clouds falling sky hand looked superior to his. How is it possible? Is this a dream? Starburst! Yi Shiwen shouted. He shot a punch, and it transformed into a star and burst out. Stars exploded everywhere, and the mighty star power swept out towards Zhuo. Zhuo had no choice but to retreat in order to avoid this dreadful star power. He even used the endless sword lights to protect himself. Bang! A violent sound of breaking of space resounded. Xiang Baiyu and young barbarian king had already arrived behind Yi Shiwen. They had arrived by taking advantage of the time when Zhuo had obstructed Yi Shiwen. The attacks of both men had been brewing long ago. After all, the continuous attacks of the other three men hadn't given them the opportunity to attack earlier. However, their attacks directly rushed towards the vital point of Yi Ziwen's body at this time. And it seemed as if this would kill him and finish the task. Bang! The attacks of both men suddenly arrived near Yi Ziwen's body. However, Yi Ziwen's body emitted scarlet rays of light and formed a scarlet barrier. Those two dreadful forces had arrived near his body, but they eventually banged on top of that scarlet barrier and gave rise to ripples. However, they couldn't break the barrier. What? A damaged great sage tool? A terrified look flashed in the eyes of both men. It was obvious that they had gotten the hint of a damaged great sage tool from this barrier. It wasn't a complete great sage tool. However, it could pose a huge threat to them even if it was a damaged one. They possessed tyrannical strength. However, they didn't have as profound heritage as Shokuin had. A damaged great sage tool was something which they couldn't obtain. However, they didn't know that Yi Ziwen's heavenly source mirror wasn't a damaged great sage tool. Instead, it was a sage tool which was just half step away from evolving into a great sage tool. Bang! Yi Shiwen took advantage of their shock and shot a fist without fooling around. The surroundings transformed into a starry sky. His fist condensed into a star river and instantly exploded after it slammed into young barbarian king's body. The young barbarian king screamed and went out flying. Endless star power frantically exploded inside his body. His body was the barbarian god's real body. But he didn't have any choice while facing such tyrannical and crazy power. It wasn't clear how many bones were broken in his entire body. He would have been torn into pieces by now if he didn't possess the legendary barbarian god's real body. Countless people in the surroundings were left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. They hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would show the vigor of a dragon and the ferocity of a tiger even in this 5-on-1 situation. The attacks of these 5 men had posed a threat for him. However, It had only posed a threat for him, nothing more. The young barbarian king was blown away for the third time. He would have been blown up if he didn't possess the barbarian god's real body. Is there no one under the great sage realm who can contend against him? This thought emerged in the minds of countless people. Humph! A cold snort came from the sky. Then a sword appeared in Zhuoxiu's hand. The murderous aura overflowed the entire place. And endless sword lights soared straight towards Yi Shiwen. We can't attack separately now. Otherwise, he'll defeat every attack. He's extremely formidable. Qilin shouted. His heart was also filled with agony. An invincible and super confident person like him had acknowledged that someone was much more powerful than him. That he wasn't a match for this person. How difficult this must have been for him. Join hands? Do you think that it'll give you a chance? Yi Shiwen sneered. The pair of golden wings unfolded behind him. Then, the golden divinities crawled over his entire body. He looked like a god of war casted from gold from afar. He moved. Only the golden shadow was left at his spot. He charged towards the young barbarian king. Yi Shiwen obviously knew the so-called saying it's better to weed out the weakest first. Young barbarian king had sustained most serious injuries among these people. So it was easiest to kill him. His hand stretched out, and it transformed into a very big hand. Zhuoxiu's sword lights were grabbed and extinguished within an instant. Zhuoxiu's sword lights were exploded therein no matter what. Other people had also figured out Yi Zaiwen's objective by this time. So they attacked one after another to kill him. After all, they couldn't let him succeed in his objective. However, the scarlet barrier formed on Yi Zaiwen's body once again. And their attacks couldn't cut open his scarlet barrier no matter what. The contest between the two sides was taking place at a great speed. It wasn't clear for how long this fight would continue if he let the young barbarian king escape. The contest would be full of uncertainties in that case. Stop him, we can't let him succeed. Those 4 men attacked at this time. Moreover, even those supporting experts on the sidelines attacked one after another. After all, they weren't fools either. How could they not see Yi Zaiwen's objective? And they couldn't let him succeed since they had figured it out. However, their speed was extremely slow. The golden light blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it arrived. Yi Zaiwen's speed was extremely quick. And he dodged these attacks at a lightning speed after unfolding the devil wings. It took long to mention all these things. However, everything had happened in an instant. Yi Shiwen had already arrived near the young barbarian king in an instant. The sword intention transformed into a lightning bolt in the sky, and smashed down. Poochie! The young barbarian king screamed. He had already been cut into 2 halves on the spot. He struggled to mend his body. However, Yi Shiwen obviously wasn't going to give him such an opportunity. The Big Bang Stardust fist smashed down, and a galaxy with inexhaustible brilliance exploded therein. Bang! Young barbarian king's soul got extinguished in an instant. Then his formidable vitality got absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Yi Shiwen felt that the heavenly source mirror had become stronger. In fact, it had reached even closer to evolving into a great sage tool after it had absorbed young barbarian king's entire vitality. However, he thought about it once again. Young barbarian king himself was just 1 step away from entering the great sage realm. And it wasn't clear how many times more tyrannical he was than an ordinary expert of half-step great sage realm. His physique wasn't as good as Yi Zaiwen's tyrant body. However, it was still top-notch. It was enough to crush the demon beasts of the same level bare-handed. A top-notch Heaven's Pride expert has fallen. Countless people began to boil. Young barbarian king's name was erased from the merit list. It was equal to declaring his death. Everyone had already acknowledged Yi Zaiwen's strength. He had the strength to explode any person in a one-on-one battle. However, he had managed to kill young barbarian king even in a 5-on-1 contest. Was this the end of the world? It's pointless. You'll certainly die today. Zhuoxiu shouted as sword energies burst out from each pore of his body. These sword energies reorganized in the sky and formed a huge sword array. This sword array immediately formed a world of swords, and overwhelmingly smashed down upon Yi Shiwen. It wasn't clear how many times more tyrannical Zhuoxiu's cultivation of sword method was than that of Yi Shiwen. He was a real sword cultivator. Yi Shiwen had extremely high understanding of the sword way. However, he merely used to do it in his spare time. Buried heaven sword. Yi Shiwen shouted. The sword intention condensed into a long sword in his hand, and suddenly swept out. It rose in the sky whilst facing against the wind, grew up to several hundred feet tall in an instant, and smashed down like lightning. Bang! Buried heaven sword and the entire sword array collided in the sky. The collision spread out the sword energies in all directions, and the traces of sword energies pierced the vast sky. However, the momentum of Yi Ziwen's buried heaven sword didn't decrease. It had already arrived in front of Zhuoxiuzhu in a flash whilst destroying the sword array all the way. Poochie! Blood splashed out. Chapter 639. Blood splashed out. And an arm went out flying in the sky. Zhuoxiuzhu groaned in depression. His complexion had turned deathly pale. His arm had been chopped off and sent off flying. Blood was unceasingly flowing out from his wound. The sword energies that Yi Shiwen had left in his body had made the blood gush out unceasingly. He didn't even get enough time to expel the sword energies that had been left behind by Yi Shiwen. It was difficult for him to conceal the terrified look in his eyes. He hadn't expected that the outcome would be like this when only young barbarian king was missing. They had suppressed Yi Shiwen when they had been 5 individuals. Therefore, Yi Shiwen hadn't been able to concentrate on killing one individual among all of them. However, Yi Shiwen had broken these restrictions like a ferocious dragon with only one person gone. How can this be possible? Everyone looked incredulously at Zhuoxiuzhu and Yi Shiwen. No matter whether it was Wind Chaser, Xiang Baiyu, or Qilin. They reckoned that Zhuoxiuzhu would have been killed by Yi Shiwen if he hadn't dodged the attack just now in advance. How could he be so formidable? It was simply hard to imagine. This went far beyond their expectations. Run, quickly run. We aren't a match for him. Wind Chaser promptly said. He was an assassin. So he would escape thousands of miles in shame if he couldn't kill a target. This was his nature. He wouldn't consider direct battles and so on. One should escape from an unfavorable situation. This was his normal thinking. No, we can't escape like this. Each one of us will be killed by him if we try to escape. Do you think he'll let us go? This monster will certainly take revenge. We've encircled him in order to kill him. So he won't leave us in any case. Qilin shouted loudly. Everyone's alarmed mind suddenly cooled down. They then thought for a while. It's really so. Even we wouldn't have left him if we had been in his place. After all, it wasn't that they didn't know the principle of rooting out the source of trouble. They might be able to kill Yi Shiwen and get a way out only by fighting with their entire strength now. It wasn't clear when, but they had vowed in the beginning. They had been full of confidence that they could kill Yi Shiwen. However, only the thought of running away was left in their minds now. What kind of sorrowful situation was this? Their determination of killing Yi Shiwen had already died out. Especially Zhuoxiuzhu's. He was definitely the most tyrannical person among them. However, his arm had already been chopped off by Yi Shiwen now. In fact, he might have been cut into 2 halves on the spot if he hadn't dodged in time. Yi Shiwen has brought that woman too. So we can give him some worries by capturing her. Someone among the experts who had surrounded Yi Shiwen shouted at this time. Consequently, everyone's vision commutatively fell on Ling Fei. She was present on the other side. Everyone believed that it would be very easy to handle Ling Fei since she looked delicate and weak. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had brought her. Quite many people had seen this. Therefore, they believed that they could compel Yi Shiwen to submit as long as they captured her. They could have a way out of this difficult situation at that time. That man's voice had just fallen when a few assassins appeared in the surrounding while everyone was in a dilemma, whether they should do this or not. All of them were the assassins of Tianya group. They then rushed towards Ling Fei to capture her. Other people might have apprehensions. However, these assassins didn't have such apprehensions. A mission would be complete as long as they could kill the enemy. There wasn't any other way for them. Taking a hostage may not have been a just and upright method in the opinion of the majority. However, nothing was off limits for them. Those 4 experts of the Tianya group had already arrived in front of Ling Fei in a moment. Her weak and delicate body slightly shivered. It seemed as if she was scared. Those experts' faces also exposed a victorious grin. We can at least prevent Yi Shiwen from attacking as long as we capture this woman. So this is the best way. Qi Lin and a few other people were already prepared to block Yi Shiwen. They would block Yi Shiwen if he tried to save her. However, who would have imagined that Yi Shiwen would directly rush towards Swordsmanship to kill him? It seemed as if Ling Fei's life or death simply didn't affect him. A few people were astonished to find that Yi Shiwen was so cold-blooded that he had just ignored this. Our goal behind taking her hostage won't be achieved if Yi Shiwen doesn't care. Won't it be wasted effort? However, they soon saw a scene which they wouldn't forget for their entire lives. Those 4 assassins who had launched a surprise attack on Ling Fei had already arrived in front of her. However, that young girl who appeared to be trembling with fear shot out her slender palm. That thin white palm smashed down. It seemed quite slow to everyone, and they could see its trajectory. However, it exploded in an instant after the preemptive strike. Bang! An assassin of Tianya group could only watch the thin white palm helplessly as it got closer and closer, and a slap finally struck his body. That expert of Tianya group was immediately blown up in the sky, and blood splashed out. He didn't have the power to fight back. It seemed as if an ant had been smashed to death without any difficulty. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. It seemed as if they had seen a ghost. Those 4 assassins of the Tianya group weren't as formidable as Wind Chaser. However, they were also dreadful experts of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm. They could even assassinate a Great Sage if the latter one didn't pay attention. In fact, even a person of Qi Lin's level was also somewhat afraid of these assassins. One of them was smashed into the sky by a slap now. How much terrifying power did this weak-looking body contain? How is it possible? She had looked afraid a moment ago. More people reacted soon after that. They were stunned as they saw this scene before their eyes. Only Yi Shiwen knew that Ling Fei's body hadn't shivered because she was afraid. Instead, it was because she was excited. Ling Fei was already in the Great Sage realm. However, Yi Shiwen could clearly see that she had very less fighting experience. It might be because of her noble status. She didn't have too much fighting experience, and a very few people would dare to attack her. Therefore, she would get very excited whenever she would come across such an opportunity to fight. Everyone finally understood why Yi Shiwen had ignored that move a moment ago. He wasn't being cold-blooded back then. Instead, he knew that this little devil was far more ferocious than him. These people didn't have the power to pose any threat to her. These people thought that they had chosen a weakling to bully. However, they had chosen a supergiant iron wall to kick instead. Everyone was a bit dumbfounded. Withdraw quickly. Those remaining experts of Tianya Group began to escape without making any delay after they realized that they had made a mistake. After all, they would escape thousands of miles in shame if they couldn't kill the target. Freeze for this young lady. Those remaining 3 experts of the Tianya Group were restricted inside the void under Ling Fei's sharp voice. In fact, her voice had seemed like the sound of a silver bell. It seemed as if they were suddenly bounded by some dreadful power. All of you are villains. Ling Fei snorted lightly. Then, a gray scepter appeared in her hand. It was as tall as a person. There was an image of a gray angel at the top of the scepter, and it was emitting incredible rays of light. That grayish angel moved and brandished the sword in its hand. It was just a small sword in the image, but it emitted endless sword beams. Those remaining 3 assassins of Tianya Group were immediately chopped off by the chaotic sword. Everyone was terrified to see this scene. The experts of late stage of half-step Great Sage realm appeared as weak as ants in front of this delicate young girl. They simply didn't have the power to fight back. However, everyone's attention immediately went back towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen hadn't stopped when everyone was left in shock by Ling Fei's dreadful strength. On the contrary, he had rushed directly towards Swordsmanship. He believed that he didn't need to worry about Ling Fei. She looked weak and delicate. However, she was an exceptionally ferocious person whom he couldn't match even if he summoned the Star Colossus avatar. Therefore, how could he let go of such an opportunity? He unfolded his devil wings and arrived in front of Swordsmanship. He was looking ruthless. It's better to break one finger rather than injuring 10 fingers. I'll break all shackles after I've killed Zhuxiuzhu. It'll be impossible for the remaining 3 to bind me after this. Clang! Sword light illuminated half of the sky. Zhuxiuzhu's pale complexion was clearly visible under the radiance. He suddenly clenched his teeth and shouted, I may die, but it'll make you share the same fate. Suddenly, endless red rays of light emitted from Zhuxiuzhu's body. This was a secret technique of his sect. His strength would rise frantically within a short time on using it. However, his cultivation realm would drop by 1 level as a cost of using it. The price was too huge. So he wasn't ready to use it until the most dangerous time. However, how strong and experienced Yi Zaiwen's eyesight was. He had found out his intentions in an instant. How could he let his enemy succeed? His iron sword shook the world. It transformed into incredible sword power and cut open the world. Don't! Qilin screamed. He could have stopped Yi Shiwen at that place. However, he had misjudged. How could Yi Shiwen not notice this? This stunning change had happened within a snap of the fingers. Poochie! Zhuxiuzhu didn't get enough time to resist. His body was penetrated by the sword power, and his soul was broken down. His entire blood essence had been absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Whoosh! A divine beam swept out from the sky and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. Wind Chaser had already arrived near him in a stealthy manner. Humph! Let's see who can save you this time. Yi Shiwen sneered. He then clenched his fist without any fear and shot a punch. Yi Zaiwen's fist power was matchless. That mighty divine beam that had been approaching him broke down under his fist pressure. However, his fist momentum didn't reduce. It slammed into the void and broke down the space. Consequently, Wind Chaser had no choice but to leap out from the subspace. He had forced out without making any delay. He could be regarded as a model assassin. However, Yi Shiwen obviously wasn't going to let him escape this time. His sword cut open the world and pierced the vast sky. He followed along with the sword and arrived in front of Wind Chaser. He was immensely proud of his speed. However, it looked nothing in front of Yi Zaiwen's speed. Bang! Wind Chaser was sliced in the sky and got transformed into a mass of blood fog. Chapter 640. The remaining 2 individuals finally lost their heads after Zhuxiuzhu and Wind Chaser got killed in succession. They panicked at this time because they had obviously become Yi Zaiwen's next target after the death of those 2 men. 5 individuals couldn't deal with him together, let alone the 2 who were left. Yi Zaiwen's vitality was getting more and more exuberant. The more enemies he killed, the more tyrannical he would become. He had obtained many profits in this fight. He could properly undergo closed-door training after returning, and he would be completely changed when he would come out of the closed-door training. Yi Shiwen could even dare to fight a great sage at that time by coordinating with the heavenly source mirror. After all, the heavenly source mirror would have become a great sage tool by then. Moreover, it would be his real body that would fight a great sage, not the Star Colossus avatar. So this was essentially different. Anyway, he must quickly settle these enemies who were present before him, and then the transformation would take place. Both men had been scared out of their wits by Yi Shiwen. 3 out of 5 men had already been killed by him. What could the remaining 2 possibly achieve? Qilin didn't speak big words like he had in the past. After all, wouldn't it be a big joke if he had said that they would encircle and kill Yi Shiwen? In fact, it would be pretty good if they didn't get slaughtered by him at this time. Run! Qilin couldn't endure anymore. He transformed into a streamer of light and was about to fly out into the void. Xiang Baiyu was beside him. His movement wasn't any slower. He also transformed into a streamer of light and flew out. Fire clouds falling sky hand. Yi Shiwen shouted. Then, a big hand suddenly stretched out and smashed down upon those 2 men who were escaping. Bang! Bang! Both men crashed into the ground like meteors. Yi Shiwen didn't hesitate any further. He stepped over and arrived near Qilin. His injuries didn't look that serious as compared to that of Xiang Baiyu. Barbarian God's real body wasn't as strong as Yi Zaiwen's tyrant body. However, it was much stronger than that of Xiangbayu. Therefore, the attack just now hadn't injured him fundamentally. Qi Lin was about to climb out of the huge crater. He himself had opened this crater after he had smashed into the ground. However, Yi Shiwen had already arrived in front of him. He attacked with the Big Bang Stardust Fist, and the surroundings transformed into a starry universe. A big and burning star among the endless stars rushed towards Qi Lin. Fire clouds falling sky-hand. Qi Lin shouted, and a big hand stretched out. It seemed as if it would definitely grab that big star. Bang! Qi Lin's palm was exploded, and blood splashed out. He couldn't block Yi Zaiwen's power. Bang! The fist momentum was unimpeded, and immediately exploded on Qi Lin's body. He was killed on the spot, and his soul was entirely extinguished. His entire blood essence was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror was also transforming at a faster speed inside Yi Zaiwen's body. In fact, it had already reached on the verge of a critical point. It only differed by one chance from making a breakthrough into the Great Sage realm and completing the transformation. Xiangbayu had also climbed out of the crater on the other side. He became scared to death when he saw this scene. 5 men had arrived to kill Yi Shiwen in the beginning, but only he was left now. Yi Zaiwen's black clothes were fluttering in the cold wind at a distant place. It wasn't clear how, but he looked like an ancient devil god which made everyone terrified. Opportunity. Yi Shiwen turned towards Xiangbayu. His eyes immediately shone. Opportunity. An opportunity is right in front of me. He stepped over. He covered the endless void, and finally arrived in front of Xiangbayu. A big hand stretched out. It then transformed into the fire clouds falling sky hand, and smashed down. Bang! A top-tier heavens pride expert of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm fell on the spot. His entire blood essence was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. A boundless and mighty scarlet aura finally burst out from Yi Zaiwen's body with a loud bang. Ha 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 ha. An unrestrained laugher came from inside Yi Zaiwen's body, and Yi Mo appeared. He rose in the wind while being dressed like a scholar. His imposing aura was getting stronger and stronger. He made the breakthrough, and became a great sage tool from a sage tool. His pair of very red eyes looked incomparably savage. He looked like a devil. Yes, he himself was a devil. He could become the devil lord of a generation if Yi Shiwen hadn't unexpectedly tamed him. He could have become a fierce devil god. He was a tool spirit. However, he wasn't an ordinary tool spirit. Instead, he was a tool spirit of the divine tool possessed by a legendary devil king. Ha 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 ha. I finally made the breakthrough. These were top-tier meals. Yi Mo released his devil characteristics which he had restrained so far after he had become a great sage tool. He still needed some time to harness this power. This and the breakthroughs made by martial arts experts were different methods leading to same result. Yi Shiwen sneered. He didn't stop Yi Mo from going all out. These people had encircled me in order to kill me. They had been harboring evil intentions. Yi Mo might not have attacked. However, I must have attacked. I can't let my mortal enemies live. These people were elites among every force. Killing all of them was like establishing extraordinary merit. Yi Shiwen didn't check those points when it came to the merit list. Some rewards were indeed given on the basis of the merit list. However, every big force had secret rewards for killing the elite disciples of the other forces. These several hundred elite disciples of the late stage of half-step Great Sage realm, who were present on the scene, were more than half of the total number of elite disciples who had participated in this Devil World competition. Moreover, there would be many rewards for killing these 5 top-tier heavens pride experts. Yi Shiwen would find it hard to calculate the exact amount. Moreover, a large group of devil experts were watching from the outside. Yi Shiwen wouldn't mind killing them and changing them into points if they tried anything. Yi Shiwen was still thinking. However, Yi Mo had already moved. A big scarlet hand spread out. It transformed into a huge devil hand. Those several hundred disciples present in the surroundings wanted to escape. However, how could they be a match for Yi Mo after he had already evolved into a great sage tool? Only a great sage could match a great sage tool. These experts were well-known figures in the half-step Great Sage realm. However, there was a difference of heaven and earth between them and great sage experts. So, how could they be compared with a real great sage? The difference between sage realm and great sage realm was indeed as massive as the separation between heaven and earth. One could reach to the heaven after crossing this one step. Some people like Yi Shiwen could become famous in the entire world by just escaping from the hands of a great sage. But it was impossible for someone to contend against a great sage. Yi Shiwen might be able to accomplish it in the future. However, it was impossible for him at present. One could well imagine how big the disparity between Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm was. Yi Mo transformed out a massive devil hand and soared to the vast sky. Those experts of half-step Great Sage Realm were running away in all directions. But they couldn't escape from his hand. All of them were caught by his hand. Bang, bang, bang. These experts were transformed into masses of blood fog one after another, and were entirely absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. These people were merely in the half-step Great Sage Realm, and weren't worth mentioning in comparison to the Great Sage experts. However, even a great sage might not be able to escape if several hundred such experts joined hands. However, their morale had already been broken by Yi Shiwen. Therefore, it was impossible for them to join hands. The scarlet rays of light on the heavenly source mirror gradually turned dim. Its aura was somewhat unstable because of recently becoming a great sage tool. However, it had slowly become stable after absorbing so much vitality. Yi Shiwen became ecstatic in his heart. His strength had increased easily and enormously after having assistance from Yi Mo. After all, Yi Mo had just become a great sage tool. He would have the advantage from now on. Moreover, his decision of throwing all his profits into the heavenly source mirror hadn't gone in vain this time. After all, he didn't need to be afraid of the suppressive power of a great sage tool after having the heavenly source mirror in his hands. This hidden card would become even more tyrannical, and his strength would rise even more if the Star Colossus avatar collaborated with the heavenly source mirror. It couldn't be compared with the current state. Top 5 experts are dead. Counting from Aguda, Li Yifeng, and Shokuin, the top 20 names on the merit list have been almost replaced by him in one stroke. My goodness, he's too terrifying. Anyone among these 5 top-notch experts could be rated as the strongest expert under the Great Sage Realm. Still, they couldn't deal with him even after joining hands. Moreover, another several hundred elites of the late stage of half-step Great Sage Realm have died at his hands. Who is he? Perhaps, the title of the strongest person under the Great Sage Realm will belong only to him in the future. The strongest person under the Great Sage Realm, only he deserves this title. Someone said, and other people became silent. Several spectators were quiet. All of them were well-known figures among the core disciples. Shokuin and other people were particularly well-known figures among each force. They were also known as the strongest individuals under the Great Sage Realm. They were the strongest men in the minds of the disciples of every force. However, only Yi Shiwen would dare to use the title of the strongest person from today onwards. Moreover, only he could use this title. After all, who else would dare to challenge the entire world? Dead, all of them are dead. Countless lords repeated this sentence in that microcosm. They saw on the merit list that first the young barbarian king, and then Zhuo Xiuzhu, Qilin Windchaser, and Xiang Baiyu. All 5 top disciples had died miserably one after another, and their names had been removed. Several hundred core disciples had been extinguished in a split second soon after that. They had been massacred. These incredible changes had finally stopped. However, countless lords had gone crazy after watching this scene. Especially those lords who had sent people to besiege Yi Shiwen. They originally wanted to deal with him, and not let him grow. However, nobody had anticipated that they would never be able to stop Yi Shiwen. On the contrary, he had taken advantage of this opportunity, and had annihilated all these disciples in one fell swoop. Thus, they had suffered a disastrous loss. These people were elites among their core disciples. Therefore, losing all of them so suddenly had injured the strength of every big force. They were extremely hurt inside. They couldn't believe the facts. How can such a monster exist in this world? How can someone contend against so many geniuses all alone? Ha 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 ha. It's a miracle. Yi Shiwen is the most talented disciples of my true martial university. True martial university was in jubilation now, whereas other forces were extremely gloomy. That you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.